Hello there and welcome to Secretum Histories. Tonight we are stepping into a question that the oldest texts never ask directly, yet never quite let go of either. We are not beginning with a story of arrival, nor with gods descending from the sky, nor with creation or destruction. We are beginning with something quieter, something more unsettling in its restraint. The idea that some messages were never meant to describe what had already happened, but to mark something that had not yet occurred. Settle in wherever you are. Let the background noise soften. Let the pace slow. What follows is not a declaration, not a revelation, and not an answer delivered with certainty. It is a careful reading of what the Sumerian texts actually do, and just as importantly, what they refuse to do. Because sometimes the most important meaning in an ancient document is not found in what is said loudly, but in what is preserved repeatedly without explanation. If you find this kind of quiet exploration soothing, if long-form history helps you disconnect and rest, you know how this works. A small gesture of support keeps this space alive and allows us to continue moving slowly through subjects that do not benefit from urgency. Now let us move into the heart of tonight's subject. The Sumerian texts, when read closely and without modern expectations imposed upon them, rarely behave like straightforward narratives. They do not rush. They do not announce their intentions. They do not frame events with clear beginnings and endings in the way modern storytelling prefers. Instead, they circle ideas, revisit names, repeat phrases across centuries, and preserve structures that feel incomplete by design. This is especially true when the subject turns toward divine presence, absence, and timing. One of the most striking features of early Mesopotamian literature is how often it speaks as if something is unfinished. Not broken, not lost, simply unfinished. Cities are founded, gods are assigned domains, humans are created, kingship is established, and yet the language frequently leaves space open, as if the current order is provisional rather than final. This is not the language of a civilization convinced that its cosmology has reached a permanent state. When modern readers approach Sumerian material, there is a strong temptation to treat it as a record of origins alone. Who came first? Who created whom? Which gods arrived and which ones followed? But the texts themselves do not limit their concern to beginnings. In several compositions, the focus subtly shifts from how the world was structured to how long that structure will hold. This shift is easy to miss because it is not announced. There are no declarations of impending return, no prophecies carved in unmistakable terms, no countdowns or calendars pointing toward a specific future moment. Instead, there are patterns, there are pauses, there are phrases that appear in contexts where they are not strictly necessary, preserved with care by scribes who copied these works generation after generation. The Anunnaki, in particular, occupy a strange position within this framework. They are not introduced as newcomers in the earliest layers of text. They are not framed as creators of the cosmos. They do not dominate the narratives of origin, and yet, their name continues to appear long after the events traditionally associated with creation and early kingship have already passed. They persist in contexts related to judgment, fate, boundaries, and transitions. This persistence matters. In Sumerian literature, gods associated with completed functions tend to fade. Deities linked to obsolete cities lose prominence as those cities decline. Rituals fall out of use when their social function disappears, but the Anunnaki do not fade in this way. Their role narrows, becomes more specific, more restrained, yet never disappears. They are repeatedly invoked in moments where order is not being established, but evaluated. This is where the idea of warning quietly begins to take shape. A warning, in the Sumerian sense, does not resemble a threat. It does not announce disaster. It does not predict catastrophe in vivid imagery. It operates structurally. It is embedded in how time is described, how authority is distributed, and how silence is introduced into the narrative. When the texts describe gods withdrawing rather than departing, when they emphasize intervals instead of endings, they create a conceptual space in which return is not dramatic but procedural. The Sumerians thought in cycles but not in circles. Their understanding of time was layered, segmented and conditional. Certain actions triggered responses, certain thresholds required intervention, and certain presences were not continuous but activated. This is especially evident in administrative texts that mirror mythological logic. Authority is delegated, oversight is assigned, responsibilities are transferred, not erased. When the Anunnaki are associated with judgment rather than governance, with fate rather than daily management, it suggests a role that becomes relevant only under specific conditions. Judges do not remain on stage when nothing is being evaluated. They wait, they observe, they return when criteria are met. This does not require belief in literal return to be meaningful. It requires recognition of how the texts frame divine involvement as conditional rather than constant. The gods most closely tied to ongoing processes like agriculture, weather and fertility appear continuously. The gods tied to boundaries appear intermittently, and the Anunnaki are consistently placed at boundaries between life and death, between order and disruption, between eras. There are moments in the texts where the narrative abruptly shifts tense. A description of what was becomes a statement of what is still in effect. A past decree is referenced as though it has not expired. The language does not say this will happen again, it says this remains established. This subtle grammatical choice carries weight in a culture where words were believed to participate in reality rather than merely describe it. Scribes were not casual record keepers. Copying a tablet was a ritual act. Deviations mattered. Preservation mattered. When a phrase appears unchanged across centuries, it is not because no one noticed it. It is because someone decided it was still relevant. Warnings, in this cultural context, are not alarms. They are structural reminders. They are embedded into legal language, into cosmological lists, into hymns that are recited long after the circumstances that produced them have passed. They persist because the condition they refer to is not resolved. Another detail worth noticing is how rarely the texts describe finality. Flood narratives end with survival, not closure. Kingship restarts. Cities are rebuilt. Divine decrees are amended rather than revoked. Even punishment is framed as regulation rather than annihilation. This creates a worldview where nothing truly ends. It pauses. It recedes. It enters dormancy. Dormancy implies potential. When later cultures reinterpret Sumerian material, this nuance often collapses. Dormancy becomes absence. Absence becomes abandonment, and abandonment becomes myth. But in the original framework, withdrawal does not mean disappearance. It means reduced visibility, reduced interaction, deferred authority. This distinction becomes especially important when considering texts that speak of gods no longer walking openly among humans, yet remaining attentive, watching without ruling, judging without intervening, waiting without announcing. The Anunnaki are uniquely suited to this role within the Sumerian system. They are not depicted as benevolent guides or constant caretakers. They are not mentors. They are not teachers. They are associated with decisions that are enacted after observation, not during participation. That makes them inconvenient figures for a culture that has moved on, and deeply unsettling figures for one that has not fully forgotten them. It is telling that references to the Anunnaki often lack narrative detail. Their actions are stated, not dramatized. Their presence is assumed, not described. This economy of language is deliberate. Excess detail invites reinterpretation. Sparse detail preserves authority. A warning does not need elaboration to function. It needs to remain intact. As we move further into this exploration, it becomes increasingly difficult to treat the Sumerian texts as naive or unsophisticated. The way they manage absence, The way they encode future relevance without prediction suggests a long-term perspective that extends beyond immediate historical memory. These texts were written by people who understood that they were not writing for themselves alone. They wrote for successors who would inherit cities, rituals, and stories without inheriting context. They wrote for a future where meaning might need to be reconstructed rather than received directly. And in doing so, they embedded reminders rather than explanations. Whether one interprets this as theological caution, mythic structure, or cultural continuity does not change the fact that the framework allows for return without requiring belief. It allows authority to reassert itself without spectacle. It allows judgment to resume without announcement, and once that structure is noticed, it becomes difficult to ignore how carefully it is maintained across texts that otherwise differ dramatically in tone and purpose. We are still only at the beginning of this pattern. What follows will require slowing down even further, paying attention to repetition, to omission, and to the moments where the texts stop explaining and simply preserve. Because warnings, especially ancient ones, rarely look like warnings at first glance. They look like leftovers. They look like formalities. They look like something copied out of habit, until they do not. There is a moment, subtle and easily overlooked, when the Sumerian tablets change their posture. Not their subject, not their language, but their orientation. Up to that point, much of what is written appears to look backward, recording origins, naming foundations, establishing how things came to be. Cities are founded, gods are assigned domains, kingship descends, order is installed. These are not memories in the modern sense, but structured recollections meant to anchor the present to a sanctioned beginning. And then, quietly, that orientation shifts. The tablets do not announce this change. There is no marker in the clay that says what follows is no longer history. Instead, it happens through grammar, through repetition, through the sudden appearance of phrases that no longer sit comfortably in a purely retrospective frame. The texts continue to speak of gods, decrees, and structures, but they do so in a way that suggests continuity rather than completion, something that remains in effect, rather than something that has ended. This is where modern readers often lose the thread, because modern historical writing assumes a clear distinction between past and future. Events are completed, consequences follow, narratives resolve. But Sumerian writing does not share this assumption. For the scribes who pressed signs into clay, time was not a line receding into distance. It was a layered field where certain conditions persisted long after their initial establishment. When the tablets stop describing the past, they do not begin predicting the future. They do something more restrained and more difficult to categorize. They begin describing states that are ongoing, but not always visible. This is most noticeable in texts that return to earlier divine actions without re-narrating them. A decree is mentioned without restating when it was issued. A boundary is referenced without describing how it was drawn. A group of gods is invoked without recounting their origin. The text assumes familiarity, but also assumes relevance. Not relevance as a literary device, but relevance as an active condition. This shift matters because it changes how the Anunnaki are positioned within the textual landscape. Early on, divine figures are introduced through genealogies and creation narratives. They are placed in sequence. One comes from another. Authority is inherited. Function is assigned. But later references to the Anunnaki do not behave this way. They do not remind the reader who these beings are. They do not explain why they matter. They simply include them, as if their role has not expired. In a culture where writing was labour-intensive, where clay tablets had to be prepared, inscribed, fired, stored and recopied, nothing was included casually. The survival of a phrase across centuries is not an accident. It reflects repeated decisions by scribes to preserve it, even when its immediate narrative function had faded. This raises an uncomfortable possibility, that some parts of the Sumerian textual tradition were not meant to inform, but to remain available. Not explanatory, but conditional. The language supports this interpretation. Verbs that should sit firmly in the past tense sometimes appear in forms that suggest continuation. Decrees are said to stand, judgments are said to be fixed, roles are said to be held, not relinquished. The implication is not that these things are happening now, but that they can happen again without requiring reauthorization. This is not prophecy. It is administrative logic applied to cosmology. In administrative texts, authority does not vanish when it is not exercised. A judge does not cease to be a judge because court is not in session. A governor does not lose legitimacy because the city is quiet. Authority remains dormant, preserved by structure rather than action. The Sumerians applied this same logic to divine roles. The Anunnaki, as they appear in later texts, are no longer described as active participants in the shaping of daily life. They are not managing rivers or overseeing harvests. They are not teaching humans skills or founding cities. Instead, they are associated with moments when outcomes are assessed rather than produced. This association becomes clearer when examining how often the Anunnaki appear alongside language related to fate, decree, and final determination. These are not processes, they are conclusions, and conclusions, by their nature, only occur when a process has reached a threshold. What threshold, then, are the texts leaving open? Another indicator appears in the way silence is treated. When the tablets recount early divine activity, they are relatively verbose. Creation is described in stages, relationships are outlined, conflicts are narrated. But as time progresses within the mythic framework, description thins. Names appear without stories. Actions are implied rather than shown. This thinning is not loss of information, it is containment. Too much explanation would anchor these figures too firmly in the past. Sparse reference keeps them untethered. This pattern can be seen in how the texts handle divine withdrawal. Gods are said to step back, to reduce their presence, to retreat from direct involvement. But they are not said to depart entirely. There is no final exit, no closing of accounts, no dissolution of authority. The language suggests relocation rather than disappearance, a shift in visibility, not existence. In this context, warning does not take the form of prediction. It takes the form of structural preservation. The texts maintain roles that are no longer exercised openly, ensuring that the conceptual machinery remains intact. This has implications for how the Sumerians understood stability. Stability was not the absence of disruption. It was the temporary alignment of conditions. When those conditions shifted, dormant mechanisms could reactivate. The Anunnaki, associated with judgment and fate, fit precisely into this dormant category. They are not needed when order functions smoothly. They become relevant when boundaries are crossed. The tablets, by continuing to reference them without elaboration, keep those boundaries in view without announcing their approach. It is also significant that later Mesopotamian cultures inherited this structure rather than dismantling it. Akkadian, Babylonian and Assyrian texts modify names, reassign emphases, and expand mythological detail, but they do not remove the Anunnaki. They reinterpret them, but they do not declare them obsolete. This continuity suggests that the idea of deferred authority remained meaningful across centuries of cultural change. Even as political systems shifted and cities rose and fell, the concept that certain powers remained in reserve persisted. This persistence would be unnecessary if the texts were merely commemorating a closed past. Closed systems do not require maintenance, open systems do. The scribes who copied these tablets lived in worlds very different from those of the original compositions. They faced new rulers, new threats, new social arrangements, yet they preserved language that implied future relevance rather than archival interest. This preservation is the closest thing the Sumerian corpus offers to a warning. Not a warning of catastrophe, but a warning of condition, a reminder that certain responses exist, whether or not they are currently visible. It is easy to misread this as superstition or mythic residue, but when viewed through the lens of institutional continuity, it appears more deliberate. Institutions preserve authority by maintaining records, not by constant enforcement. The tablets function in the same way. When the tablets stop describing the past, they do not become silent. They become restrained. They move from narrative into framework. They stop telling stories and start maintaining positions. This shift creates a tension that modern readers often feel without being able to articulate. The sense that something is unresolved, that the story did not end where it seemed to, that the gods did not finish what they began. But from within the Sumerian worldview, this was not unresolved. It was simply not active. The implication is not that the Anunnaki are waiting in anticipation, but that the structure that allows for their involvement remains intact. A structure that does not require belief to function, only recognition. As long as the tablets are read, copied and preserved, that structure continues to exist. Not as a promise, not as a threat, but as a condition embedded in how the world is understood. And it is from within this condition that later interpretations begin to emerge, sometimes distorting the restraint of the original texts into something louder and more dramatic. But beneath those later layers, the original posture remains visible to those who look closely enough. The tablets do not shout, they do not predict, they do not explain themselves repeatedly. They hold their position and wait. And in doing so, they quietly suggest that not everything they describe belongs only to what has already happened. There is a particular kind of language that does not announce its direction. It uses familiar grammar. It adopts forms associated with memory. It appears to be rooted firmly in what has already occurred, and yet when examined carefully it refuses to remain contained there. This is the language that fills much of the Sumerian textual tradition, once the foundational narratives have been established. Language that looks backward but does not stay there. These words are not futuristic in tone. They do not speculate. They do not forecast. They rely instead on permanence, on statements that are framed as having been set, fixed, established. The effect is subtle but profound. A decree described as having been issued in the distant past continues to function as an active condition. A boundary drawn long ago remains enforceable. A role assigned in primordial time is never explicitly revoked. This is not accidental phrasing. In Sumerian culture, words were not inert markers of past events. Words participated in reality. A decree spoken or written did not simply record authority, it enacted it, and unless formally undone, that authority remained in force. This is why so many Sumerian compositions feel unfinished to modern readers. They do not resolve in the way later narratives do. They do not conclude by closing off possibility. Instead, they preserve states of affairs that can be re-entered. The language holds doors open without describing what might pass through them. This becomes especially important when reading texts that reference divine actions using formulas that should, by modern standards, be purely historical. Phrases such as "it was established," "the decree stands," or "the fate was fixed" appear again and again. These expressions suggest finality, but only within a particular frame. They indicate that a rule has been set, not that its application is complete. In legal and administrative documents from Mesopotamia, the same logic applies. A law recorded on a tablet does not expire because the case it addressed has ended. It remains available, enforceable whenever conditions arise that call for it. Mythological language follows the same principle. A divine judgment is not consumed by its first use. When the Anunnaki are referenced in such contexts, they are not treated as figures whose relevance belong to a closed epoch. They are invoked as authorities whose function remains valid, even if inactive. The words that describe their role are backward-facing in form, but forward-facing in implication. This dual orientation is reinforced by the way time is handled in Sumerian writing. Temporal markers are often vague or deliberately absent. Events are placed in relation to cosmic stages rather than calendar dates. The effect is to loosen chronology and strengthen condition. What matters is not when something happened, but under what circumstances it becomes relevant again. The Sumerians did not think of time as an irreversible flow that carried all events away from relevance. They thought of it as a series of states that could recur under similar conditions. This is why flood narratives exist in multiple versions without concern for contradiction. The flood is not merely an event, it is a response. It can occur whenever the conditions that triggered it reappear. The same logic applies to judgment. Judgment is not tied to a single historical moment. It is tied to thresholds. When certain limits are crossed, mechanisms activate. The words that describe those mechanisms do not need to change. They already exist. This is where the idea of warning enters, not as explicit instruction, but as structural implication. A warning in this context is not a message about the future. It is the continued presence of language that presupposes the future possibility of application. The tablets preserve lists of divine names long after those names cease to appear in active mythological scenes. They preserve roles without narratives. They preserve decrees without reenactments. This is not negligence. It is preservation of capacity. Capacity is the key concept here. The words that look backward describe capacities that have not been exhausted, authority that has not been consumed, judgment that has not been permanently resolved. In later periods, as Mesopotamian cultures changed and absorbed new influences, these words became increasingly opaque. Their original context faded. Their immediate relevance became harder to see. But the words remained, copied faithfully by scribes who may not have fully understood their original function, yet recognized their importance. This copying is itself an act of orientation toward the future. A scribe does not preserve meaningless text. Even when comprehension fades, reverence remains, and reverence implies expectation, even if undefined. The Anunnaki occupy a peculiar position within this preserved language. They are not described in motion. They are not shown arriving or departing. They are associated with decisions that have consequences beyond the moment of their issuance. They are the ones who determine fate, not in the sense of daily control, but in the sense of ultimate accounting. Words associated with them often appear in formulaic contexts. Lists, invocations, judicial settings. These are not storytelling environments. They are institutional ones. They are designed to endure. Institutional language does not narrate. It authorizes. When the tablets use such language, they stop behaving like stories and start behaving like frameworks. The past tense becomes a way of asserting legitimacy rather than closure. The effect is to stabilize authority across time. This is why attempts to read these texts as literal predictions or coded prophecies miss the point. The Sumerians were not trying to warn of a specific event. They were maintaining a system in which certain responses remained available. Modern cultures tend to externalize warning, sirens, signs, explicit alerts. The Sumerian approach was internal, embedded, structural. The warning was not spoken. It was built into how the world was understood. To remove that structure would have required deliberate action. A rewriting of the cosmology, a formal declaration that certain authorities no longer applied. No such declaration exists in the surviving texts. Instead, what exists is continuity. The same names copied across centuries, the same roles preserved even as their narratives thin, the same phrases repeated in contexts where they no longer seem necessary, unless they are serving a function beyond narration. This function becomes clearer when considering how Sumerian texts handle failure. When gods err, their authority is not erased, it is modified. When decrees lead to unintended consequences, they are adjusted, not annulled. The system remains intact even when individual applications prove problematic. This suggests a worldview that values stability of structure over finality of outcome. A worldview in which mechanisms are refined rather than dismantled. Within such a system, words that look backward are not passive. They are active components of continuity. They ensure that certain responses remain possible without needing to be reinvented. The Anunnaki, bound to judgment and fate, fit precisely into this preserved category. Their words do not describe ongoing activity. They describe standing authority, authority that does not need constant expression to remain valid. As time passes within the textual tradition, the narrative spotlight moves elsewhere. New gods rise in prominence. New cities become central. New concerns dominate mythological attention. But the foundational language remains. This coexistence of change and preservation is one of the most distinctive features of Sumerian literature. It allows the culture to adapt without severing its conceptual roots. It allows new meanings to emerge without erasing old structures. For modern readers, this creates a sense of unease, the feeling that something is being implied without being stated, that the texts are aware of more than they are saying. But from within the original context, this restraint is not ominous, it is practical. It reflects a culture that understood the danger of overspecification. The more precisely one predicts, the more easily one can be wrong. The more narrowly one defines authority, the easier it is to invalidate. By preserving language that is broad, institutional and conditional, the Sumerians ensure that their cosmology could remain relevant across unforeseeable futures. This is not mysticism. It is governance applied to myth. The words that look backward but point forward are doing exactly what they were designed to do. They anchor authority in the past while keeping it available for future application. They prevent closure without inviting panic. They are not waiting for an event. They are maintaining readiness. And it is from this readiness, preserved quietly in clay and repetition, that later generations would draw meanings that the original authors never needed to spell out. The Sumerians did not treat memory and warning as interchangeable ideas. This distinction is subtle, but it sits at the core of how their texts function. Modern readers often approach ancient material assuming that anything preserved from the past is meant to remember what has already happened. But in Sumerian thought, memory was not only about preservation, it was also about regulation, and warning was not something announced, it was something maintained. Memory, as the Sumerians understood it, was not personal recollection, it was structural. It existed outside the individual and endured beyond any single generation. A memory written into clay did not belong to the scribe who wrote it, or the king who commissioned it. It belonged to the order of things. It was a component of reality, not a reflection of it. Warnings, by contrast, were not urgent messages aimed at provoking immediate action. They were not alarms. They were conditions embedded into memory itself. The Sumerians did not separate the act of remembering from the act of maintaining readiness. To remember correctly was already to be warned. This is why so many Sumerian texts feel strangely restrained when they touch on danger or divine displeasure. There is no escalation of tone, no insistence that something terrible is coming. Instead, the text returned to formulas, to lists, to phrases that reaffirm how the world responds when certain boundaries are crossed. The warning is not emotional, it is procedural. This distinction becomes especially important when reading passages that refer to divine judgment. Judgment in Sumerian thought is not revenge. It is correction. It restores balance rather than punishes transgression. A warning, therefore, does not threaten destruction. It reminds the reader that correction exists. Memory preserves the record of correction having occurred before. Warning preserves the knowledge that it can occur again. The Sumerians lived in an environment where stability was fragile. Floods could erase cities. Droughts could collapse food systems. Political authority shifted rapidly. In such a world, predicting specific disasters would have been impractical. What mattered was understanding the patterns by which disorder emerged and how it was addressed. Their texts reflect this orientation. Instead of telling readers what will happen, they show what happens when certain conditions repeat. This is not fatalism. It is pattern recognition. Memory, then, serves as a catalogue of responses. Warning exists in the preservation of those responses without expiration dates. This is why Sumerian literature is so heavily invested in repetition. Repetition is not redundancy, it is reinforcement. By copying the same hymns, the same decrees, the same divine roles across centuries, scribes were not merely honouring tradition. They were keeping mechanisms active. A mechanism does not need to be in use to remain functional. It only needs to be intact. When the Anunnaki appear in this framework, they are not memories of a lost age. They are components of a system that still exists. Their association with judgment places them firmly in the category of warning, not nostalgia. They are not remembered because they were important once. They are remembered because their role has not been abolished. The difference between memory and warning becomes clearer when examining how Sumerian texts handle divine anger. Anger is described, but it is rarely dramatized. Gods are displeased. Noise disturbs them. Order becomes strained. And then a response occurs. The texts do not dwell on the emotional experience of the gods. They focus on the outcome. This focus reveals a worldview in which the emotional state is secondary to the structural response. A warning, therefore, does not need to convey fear. It needs to convey consequence. Memory records that consequence occurred. Warning exists in the understanding that the same structure remains in place. This is why Sumerian flood narratives do not conclude with reassurance that such an event will never happen again. Later traditions introduce covenants and guarantees. The Sumerians do not. They are just conditions. They impose limits. They reduce lifespans. They introduce mechanisms to regulate population. These are not promises. They are controls. The flood is remembered. The warning is embedded in the adjustments that follow. This pattern appears repeatedly across genres. In royal inscriptions, kings describe how order was restored after chaos, not how chaos was permanently eliminated. In hymns, gods are praised for stabilizing the world, not for ending instability forever. In legal texts, punishments are specified, not abolished. Nothing is framed as final. In this context, warning is not a message directed at the future. It is the continued presence of structures that govern response. The future does not need to be described because the system that handles it already exists. The Anunnaki fit seamlessly into this logic. Their role is not explained repeatedly because explanation is unnecessary. Their function is known. They are invoked when judgment is required, not when history is being recounted. Modern readers often mistake this restraint for absence. They assume that if a figure is not actively described, it has lost relevance. But in Sumerian thought, relevance is not tied to visibility. It is tied to legitimacy. A legitimate authority does not need constant reaffirmation. It needs preservation. The scribes who copied these texts understood this. Even when their own political realities changed, even when new gods rose in prominence, they did not erase older structures. They layered new interpretations over them. This layering preserved continuity while allowing adaptation. Memory, therefore, is cumulative. Warning is inherent. This approach also explains why Sumerian texts rarely speculate about the future in imaginative terms. There is no attempt to describe what the world will look like in centuries to come. That kind of speculation would be meaningless in a system where conditions, not timelines, determine outcomes. Instead, the texts emphasize readiness. Cities must maintain temples. Kings must uphold justice. Humans must respect boundaries. Gods respond when these obligations are neglected. This is not a warning of return. It is a warning of consequence. When later readers interpret references to divine withdrawal as absence, they miss the Sumerian distinction. Withdrawal does not nullify authority. It suspends interaction. The authority remains intact, preserved through memory. The Anunnaki are not said to depart permanently. They are said to occupy domains where they are not seen. This invisibility does not reduce their legitimacy. It preserves it. This is why the language surrounding them remains formal, institutional, and restrained. It does not invite imagination. It enforces recognition. Memory in this sense is not sentimental, it is operational. It ensures that warning remains active without needing to be voiced. The difference between memory and warning in Sumerian thought is therefore not about time, it is about function. Memory records what has already been enacted. Warning ensures that the same enactment remains possible. The two are inseparable, but not identical. To remember incorrectly is dangerous because it disrupts the structure. To forget entirely is worse, because it removes the mechanism. The Sumerians chose neither, they preserved. This preservation did not require belief, it required maintenance. As long as the texts were copied, the system endured. From this perspective, the warning is not something the Sumerians feared, it is something they respected. It represented order's ability to reassert itself when necessary. There is no anxiety in this worldview, only acceptance. The gods are not portrayed as unpredictable monsters. They are predictable within their domains. They respond when thresholds are crossed. They recede when balance is restored. The Anunnaki, associated with judgment, embody this predictability. They do not act impulsively. They act when invoked by condition. This is why their continued presence in the texts matters, not because it predicts a return, but because it confirms that the structure allowing for return remains intact. The warning is not that something will happen. The warning is that something can happen, and in Sumerian thought, that distinction was enough. There are lines in the Sumerian texts that behave differently from the rest. They are not expanded. They are not clarified. They are not justified. They appear intact and unchanged, copied from tablet to tablet across centuries, surviving political collapse, linguistic shifts, and religious reinterpretation without ever being fully absorbed into the surrounding explanation. These lines do not invite understanding. They demand preservation. Modern readers often assume that repetition without explanation indicates confusion, or perhaps blind tradition. But in the Scribal culture of ancient Mesopotamia, this assumption does not hold. Scribes were trained rigorously. They memorized lexical lists, grammatical structures, and canonical compositions. They knew when a line was obscure and they knew when a line was incomplete. And yet they copied certain phrases anyway, without gloss, without commentary, without attempt to clarify their meaning for future readers. This behavior is deliberate. To understand why, it helps to understand what scribes believe their role to be. They were not authors in the modern sense. They were custodians. Their task was not to improve texts, but to maintain them. Alteration was not creativity, it was risk. Changing a line meant interfering with something that had already been sanctioned, whether by tradition, by temple authority, or by the gods themselves. Some lines therefore were treated as untouchable, not because their meaning was clear, but because their function was considered intact regardless of comprehension. These lines often appear at moments of transition. A list of gods concludes with names that are not elaborated. A decree is cited without context. A formula is repeated in a ritual text even though its application is no longer obvious. In each case, the scribe chooses preservation over interpretation. This choice reveals a great deal about how warning operates in the Sumerian tradition. A warning to remain effective across time cannot be too specific. Specificity decays, context changes, explanations age, but structure endures. By copying lines without explanation, scribes ensured that the structural component remained available even as interpretive frameworks shifted. This is not ignorance, it is restraint. Consider how modern legal systems preserve language long after its original circumstances have disappeared. Phrases remain embedded in law that no longer reflect everyday usage. Their meaning is preserved not by constant explanation, but by precedent. They function because they are recognized as authoritative, not because they are understood intuitively. Sumerian scribes applied a similar logic to mythological and cosmological language. Certain lines were preserved because they anchored authority. Removing or rephrasing them would have disrupted the balance of the text. Leaving them unexplained allowed future generations to reinterpret them without losing their force. This is particularly noticeable in passages involving divine assemblies, decrees, and judgments. A line may state that a decision was fixed, or that certain gods were present, without explaining the criteria or outcome. The reader is not told what was decided, only that the mechanism of decision-making was activated. The Anunnaki appear frequently in these unexplained lines. They are named in lists where no actions follow. They are invoked in formulas that do not specify their response. They are acknowledged in context where their presence is assumed rather than described. These lines do not teach the reader who the Anunnaki are. They presuppose that knowledge, or more precisely, they presuppose that the knowledge is not required to be explicit. This creates an important distinction. What is explained is what must be learned. What is preserved without explanation is what must be accepted. The Sumerians did not expect every reader to understand every line. They expected readers to respect the structure. In a culture where literacy was limited and specialized, this makes sense. The texts were not meant to be consumed independently by individuals. They were meant to function within institutions. Within an institution, not every rule needs explanation. Some rules are simply enforced. The lines that scribes copied without explaining often occupy this institutional space. They function as markers of authority rather than conveyors of narrative information. This becomes clearer when examining how these lines are treated over time. Later cultures inherited Sumerian texts and adapted them. Akkadian translations were produced. Names were adjusted. New interpretations were layered on top of old material. And yet certain lines remained remarkably stable. Even when the surrounding language changed, these lines did not. This stability suggests that their value did not lie in their descriptive content, but in their role within the system. They were load-bearing elements. Removing them would have caused the structure to collapse. Warnings embedded in this way are not dramatic. They do not announce danger. They ensure that certain responses remain legitimate. A line stating that judgment belongs to a specific group of gods does not need to describe when that judgment will occur. Its presence alone maintains the authority of that group. The reader does not need to be told what to fear. The structure itself enforces restraint. This is why modern interpretations that seek hidden messages or coded predictions often miss the point. The power of these lines lies precisely in their lack of explanation. They resist closure. Explanation fixes meaning. Preservation preserves possibility. Sumerian scribes understood that meaning shifts over time, but authority must remain stable. By copying lines without explaining them, they allowed future readers to project new understandings onto old frameworks without breaking continuity. This is not an invitation to speculation. It is an acknowledgement of uncertainty. The scribes did not claim to know everything. They did not assume that their understanding was final. They assumed that the texts would outlive them, and that future generations would encounter conditions they could not anticipate. Warnings, therefore, were not delivered as messages. They were embedded as structures that could activate under unforeseen circumstances. The Anunnaki, associated with judgment and fate, are preserved in precisely this way. Their role is not elaborated because elaboration would constrain it. Their presence is acknowledged, not explained, allowing their function to remain flexible. This flexibility is essential for a warning that is meant to endure. If the text had specified exactly how and when the Anunnaki would act, those specifications would eventually become obsolete. By leaving their role undefined beyond certain boundaries, the texts ensure that the concept remains relevant regardless of historical change. The scribe's decision to copy these lines faithfully, even when their immediate relevance was unclear, reflects a deep respect for the integrity of the system. They understood that their task was not to resolve ambiguity, but to maintain it where resolution would be premature. Ambiguity in this context is not confusion, it is openness. The Sumerian worldview did not require certainty to function, it required balance. Ambiguous lines allow the system to absorb new realities without fracturing. This is why attempts to read these lines as evidence of forgotten technology or hidden prophecy often feel unsatisfying. Such readings impose specificity where the original texts deliberately avoid it. They seek answers where the structure was designed to preserve conditions. The lines the scribes copied without explaining are not secrets waiting to be decoded. They are anchors. They hold the system in place. Their continued presence across centuries suggests that the scribes recognized their importance even when comprehension faded. This recognition is itself a form of warning. It acknowledges that not everything needs to be understood immediately to remain valid. In modern terms, this might feel uncomfortable. We're accustomed to explanations, to transparency, to resolution. But in a world where divine and human realms were deeply intertwined, restraint was a form of wisdom. To explain too much was to risk error. To preserve structure was to ensure continuity. The Anunnaki's persistence in these unexplained lines does not announce their return. It maintains the legitimacy of their role. It keeps the mechanism intact. This mechanism does not operate continuously. It does not intrude into daily life. It waits for conditions. The scribes, by copying these lines without explanation, ensured that the waiting did not become forgetting. They did not need to understand everything they preserved. They needed to preserve what mattered. And in doing so, they passed forward not a prediction, but a framework. One that remains quiet, intact, and ready, without ever needing to announce itself. There is a noticeable asymmetry in how the Sumerian texts speak about divine presence. Some gods are described as remaining, others are described as withdrawing, and a small but significant group are spoken of in terms that imply return rather than continuity. This difference is not accidental, and it is not poetic flourish. It reflects a precise way of categorizing divine function within the Sumerian understanding of order. To remain implies constancy. It suggests a role that is required continuously, regardless of circumstance. Gods associated with fertility, water, agriculture, and daily survival fall into this category. Their presence is assumed because their function never pauses. Crops require water whether times are stable or chaotic. Rivers must flow regardless of political order. Birth, illness, and death occur in every era. Deities tied to these processes are described as dwelling permanently within the world. Return implies something else entirely. It implies absence that is structured, deliberate, and conditional. A god who returns is not one who has vanished. It is one whose function is not always required. Their authority exists independently of their visibility. They act when conditions demand it, and recede when those conditions are no longer present. This distinction is crucial for understanding why certain gods, particularly those associated with judgment and fate, are framed as returning rather than remaining. The Sumerians did not imagine the world as needing constant correction. Order once established could sustain itself for long periods. Cities functioned. Laws governed behaviour. Rituals maintained balance between human and divine realms. In such periods, gods of judgment were not active participants. Their continued presence would have implied ongoing crisis. Instead, these gods occupied a latent position. They were acknowledged, named, and preserved in texts, but not dramatized. Their absence from daily narrative was itself a sign that order was holding. This is why the language surrounding their involvement is restrained. When they appear, it is often sudden, formulaic, and without build-up. There is no transition scene, no explanation of arrival. They are simply present, as if they had always been there, waiting. Return in this context does not mean physical travel. It means activation. The Anunnaki are consistently associated with this pattern. They are not depicted overseeing irrigation or teaching crafts. They are invoked at moments where outcomes are decided rather than processes managed. They do not guide, they assess. Because assessment is not continuous, neither is their presence. This framework allows the Sumerian text to acknowledge divine authority without depicting constant interference. It also avoids the implication that the gods are watching every human action at all times. Instead, it suggests a system where oversight intensifies when thresholds are crossed. This is not surveillance, it is governance. In governance, inspectors do not live permanently on site. Courts are not always in session. Judges do not rule continuously. They convene when a case exists. Their authority does not diminish during periods of inactivity. It remains intact, preserved by institutional structure. The Sumerians projected this logic onto their cosmology. Some gods remain because their work never stops. Others return because their work only begins when balance is threatened. This helps explain why texts sometimes speak of divine withdrawal without describing divine departure. Withdrawal reduces interaction. It does not cancel authority. A god who withdraws can return without contradiction. This language also explains why the Sumerians did not record a final departure of certain gods. There is no account of the Anunnaki leaving permanently. There is no declaration that their role has ended. Such a declaration would have been dangerous within the logic of the system. It would have removed a necessary corrective mechanism. Instead, the texts preserve their legitimacy without invoking their presence unnecessarily. Modern readers often interpret this absence as mythic fading. But within the Sumerian framework, fading is not erasure. It is dormancy. Dormant authority is more stable than constant intervention. It allows the system to function without divine micromanagement, while retaining the ability to respond decisively when needed. This distinction also reveals why the idea of return carries more weight than the idea of remaining. Remaining implies sameness. Return implies change. A god who returns does so because conditions have shifted. Something has occurred that requires reassessment. The return itself is not the cause of disruption. It is the response to it. The texts never need to describe the return in detail because the return is not the focus. The focus is the condition that necessitated it. This is why references to return often appear without narrative elaboration. The texts do not ask the reader to imagine the event, they ask the reader to recognize the implication. The implication is that order has been strained. This framing also protects the text from becoming obsolete. If gods were described as remaining constantly present, their absence in later experience would require explanation. By framing certain gods as returning, the texts remain compatible with long periods of apparent silence. Silence does not contradict return, it enables it. The Anunnaki, bound to judgment, are perfectly suited to this role. Judgment is not constant, it is episodic. It occurs at boundaries. When those boundaries are crossed, the judges are invoked. This invocation does not require belief. It requires acknowledgement of structure. The Sumerians did not need to see the Anunnaki to believe in their authority. Their authority was embedded in the texts, in the legal language, in the ritual formulas. As long as these structures existed, the possibility of return remained intact. This possibility functions as a warning without ever being stated as such. It reminds the culture that order is not self-sustaining indefinitely. It requires adherence to boundaries. If boundaries are ignored long enough, dormant mechanisms activate. The gods who remain maintain the world. The gods who return correct it. This distinction explains why certain divine names persist, even when their stories fade. Their stories are not required for their function. Their function is required for the system. The scribes understood this. They preserved names without narratives, roles without scenes, authority without spectacle. To explain return too vividly would have anchored it to a specific event. To leave it understated preserves its applicability across time. This is not fear-based thinking. It is maintenance-based thinking. The Sumerian worldview did not revolve around expectation of divine intervention. It revolved around respect for thresholds. As long as thresholds held, return was unnecessary. But the texts never allow the possibility of permanent immunity. By saying that some gods return rather than remain, the texts encode a simple principle. Order is conditional, authority exists beyond visibility, and correction does not need to be constant to be real. The Anunnaki are not waiting in anticipation, they are preserved in readiness, and that readiness, quiet and unannounced, is what gives the idea of return its enduring weight without ever requiring the texts to say more than they do. There are names in the Sumerian texts that do something unusual once they are spoken. They appear, they are acknowledged, and then the narrative steps away. No description follows, no action is assigned, no clarification is offered. The text continues as if the name itself was sufficient. This silence is not absence, it is deliberate restraint. In most mythological traditions, naming is followed by elaboration. A god is introduced, their powers are explained, their personality is outlined, their deeds are recounted. The Sumerian texts do this often, especially with deities involved in creation, fertility, kingship, and daily life. These gods are described in detail because their interaction with the world is constant and visible. But there is a different category of name that behaves differently. These names do not invite narrative expansion, they halt it. The silence that follows them is consistent across texts, genres, and time periods. It is not a gap left by damaged tablets or lost lines. It is present even in well-preserved compositions. The scribe writes the name, places it carefully, and moves on. This silence is meaningful. In Sumerian thought, not all knowledge was meant to be unfolded. Some knowledge was meant to be acknowledged and left intact. Explanation could weaken authority by making it too familiar. Silence preserved distance. The Anunnaki belong firmly to this category. When their name appears, it is often embedded within lists, decrees, or judicial contexts. The text does not pause to remind the reader who they are. It does not recount their origin. It does not narrate their actions unless absolutely necessary. Their presence is assumed to carry weight without elaboration. This is not because the scribes lacked material. Earlier texts demonstrate that they were capable of extensive mythological exposition when they chose to do so. The silence is therefore intentional. To understand this silence, it is necessary to understand how the Sumerians treated authority. Authority was not something that needed constant justification. The more foundational the authority, the less explanation it required. Excessive elaboration suggested instability. Silence suggested permanence. In legal texts, the highest authority is often referenced without description. The king's title alone is enough. The law does not explain why the king has power. It assumes it. To explain it would be to open it to challenge. The same principle applies to divine authority. Names associated with ultimate judgment or cosmic boundaries are not expanded because expansion invites interpretation. Interpretation invites disagreement. Silence closes the door. This silence is especially striking when compared to the verbosity surrounding other divine figures. Gods like Enki, Inanna, or Utu are richly described. Their motivations are explored. Their conflicts are narrated. Their personalities are visible. They act within the world and therefore require explanation. The Anunnaki do not act within the world in this way. They intervene at its limits. This difference explains why the texts grow quiet around them. Limits do not require narration. They require recognition. The silence also serves a practical function. It prevents the Anunnaki from becoming too closely associated with any single era or event. If their actions were narrated in detail, they would be anchored to specific historical circumstances. Silence allows their role to remain abstract and therefore adaptable. This adaptability is essential for a system that is meant to endure. The Sumerians did not expect their world to remain static. They experienced repeated cycles of collapse and reconstruction. Cities fell, dynasties ended, floods reshaped the land. In such a world, rigid narratives would quickly become obsolete. Structural roles preserved through silence remained applicable. The silence following certain names also protects the text from contradiction. By not specifying how or when these gods act, The texts avoid creating expectations that could later be disproven. The authority remains intact because it is never tested openly. This is not deception, it is caution. The scribes understood that divine authority operates on a different scale than human experience. Attempting to describe it in familiar terms would diminish it. Silence preserves transcendence. This pattern can be observed in how the texts handle divine punishment. When punishment is enacted, the mechanism is described, but the judges themselves often remain in the background. The focus is on the outcome, not the deliberation. The Anunnaki are acknowledged as the ones who decree, but their deliberation is not narrated. This absence of deliberation is significant. It suggests that their decisions are not subject to debate or persuasion within the narrative. They are final not because they are loud, but because they are beyond argument. Silence enforces finality without spectacle. Modern readers often interpret silence as loss, as if something has been forgotten or erased. But in the Sumerian tradition, silence often marks what must not be altered. It signals that the name carries authority sufficient to stand alone. This is why later cultures retained these names even when their myths were no longer fully understood. The names were preserved because their function was still recognized, even if their stories were not retold. The silence also acts as a boundary for the reader. It signals where interpretation should stop. Not every aspect of the divine order is available for human analysis. Some elements are simply acknowledged. This boundary reinforces humility. It reminds the reader that the text is not offering mastery over the cosmos. It is offering alignment with it. The Anunnaki, associated with fate and judgment, embody this boundary. Their silence is not emptiness. It is containment. Containment prevents misuse. A fully explained mechanism can be manipulated. A silent one cannot. This may help explain why the Anunnaki are so resistant to later reinterpretation within the original texts. When later mythologies attempt to expand their role, they often do so by adding narrative detail that was never present in the Sumerian material. These expansions feel foreign because they violate the original restraint. This silence was part of the design. It ensured that the Anunnaki remained judges rather than characters. Characters invite empathy. Judges require distance. This distance also supports the idea of return without anticipation. A god whose absence is narrated creates expectation. A god whose absence is silent creates readiness without anxiety. The texts do not encourage the reader to wait. They encourage the reader to maintain balance. This is why the silence is not ominous. It is stabilizing. It reassures that authority exists without intruding. The scribes, by copying these names without explanation, participated in this stabilization. They resisted the temptation to clarify. They trusted the structure. Trust is essential here. The scribes trusted that the silence was intentional. They trusted that not everything needed to be understood to remain valid. This trust extended across generations. Even when language evolved and pronunciation shifted, the names remained. The silence remained with them. The effect of this over time is cumulative. Each generation encounters the name, notes the absence of explanation, and accepts it as part of the inherited order. The silence becomes normalized. This normalization is powerful. It embeds authority so deeply that it no longer needs defense. The Anunnaki, preserved in silence, become part of the background architecture of the cosmos. They are not foreground figures. They are load-bearing supports. When later readers sense unease around these names, it is often because modern expectations clash with ancient restraint. We expect explanation. The texts offer acknowledgement. This clash can be misread as mystery or secrecy. But within the Sumerian worldview, it is simply proper form. Not all names are meant to be spoken loudly. Some are meant to be placed carefully and left untouched. The silence that follows certain names is therefore not a void. It is a signal. It marks where the system ends and interpretation must stop. This signal does not warn of impending action. It warns of enduring authority. The Anunnaki do not announce themselves. They do not need to. Their presence is encoded in the structure of the texts themselves. As long as those texts are preserved, the silence remains. And as long as the silence remains, the authority it protects does not disappear. It does not remain visibly present. It does not act continuously. It does not intrude, but it does not leave. It waits intact, without explanation, exactly as the scribes intended. The Sumerian understanding of time does not move in a straight line, and it does not close behind itself. It advances, recedes, pauses, and resumes, but it rarely concludes. This is not because the Sumerians lacked a concept of sequence, but because sequence was not their primary concern. What mattered was recurrence. What mattered was the spacing between events, the intervals that separated one state of order from another, and the conditions under which those states reappeared. Cycles are often misunderstood as repetition without change. In the Sumerian framework, cycles are not repetitions, they are regulated returns. Each cycle carries memory forward, altered by what came before it. A flood does not erase the world entirely. It resets conditions. Kingship does not begin anew from nothing. It resumes with modification. Divine authority does not vanish. It withdraws, then reasserts itself when the structure requires it. This distinction between cycle and repetition is essential. Repetition implies inevitability. Cycles imply contingency. A cycle occurs only when conditions align. Between those occurrences lies the interval. The interval is where Sumerian thought becomes most precise and most easily overlooked. The texts speak far more often about what happens after an event than about the event itself. After creation comes regulation. After the flood comes limitation. After divine proximity comes distance. These transitions are not framed as losses. They are framed as adjustments. The interval between one state and the next is not empty. It is managed. Waiting, in this context, is not passive. It is structured. The language of waiting appears throughout the Sumerian corpus, but it is rarely labelled as such. Instead, it is embedded in how authority is deferred, how roles are suspended, and how future action is implied without being announced. Waiting does not mean uncertainty. It means readiness without urgency. This becomes particularly clear when examining how time is measured. Sumerian texts often avoid precise dating when discussing cosmic or divine matters. Instead of counting years, they refer to eras. Instead of specifying durations, they describe conditions. This allows time to stretch or compress depending on circumstance. In this system, an interval is not defined by length. It is defined by purpose. The Anunnaki, associated with judgment and fate, occupy these intervals. They do not dominate the cycle itself. They appear at the points where cycles shift. They are present at thresholds, not within continuity. This placement is deliberate. It reinforces the idea that their role is not to maintain order continuously, but to intervene when order transitions. The language that surrounds them reflects this. They are named in contexts that imply pause rather than motion. Their involvement is associated with decisions that occur after observation, not during action. The Sumerian texts rarely describe divine impatience. Gods do not rush. They wait. They observe. They respond when conditions demand response. This is not indifference. It is governance. Waiting, therefore, is not absence of care. It is an expression of control. The interval between divine actions is where human agency operates. Humans build, govern, worship, and fail within these spaces. The gods do not interfere constantly because interference would collapse responsibility. By waiting, the divine order allows human systems to function and to be tested. This testing is not framed as a trial in the moral sense. It is structural. Systems are allowed to run until they reach a limit. Only then is correction applied. The flood narratives illustrate this clearly. The gods do not intervene at the first sign of human excess. They wait. Noise increases. Population grows. The strain accumulates. Only when the threshold is crossed does action occur. The interval preceding the flood is not described in detail. It is not dramatized. It is summarized. This suggests that the specifics of human activity during that time are less important than the fact that activity exceeded acceptable bounds. The same pattern applies to divine withdrawal. After the establishment of order, gods recede. They do not disappear. They wait. The interval is not a gap in authority. It is a test of sustainability. Cycles require intervals to remain meaningful. Without intervals, cycles collapse into monotony. The Sumerians understood this intuitively. Their rituals were periodic, not constant. Their festivals marked transitions, not continuities. Their prayers acknowledged dependence without demanding immediate response. Waiting was built into religious practice. The language that encodes this waiting is restrained. There are no countdowns, no prophecies announcing when the interval will end. The end of waiting is determined by condition, not time. This has profound implications for how warnings function. A warning in such a system does not say when something will happen. It reminds the reader that waiting is not permanent, that intervals exist for a reason, that patience does not equal immunity. The Anunnaki, bound to judgment, are part of this reminder. Their association with fate places them at the moment when waiting ends and assessment begins. They are not involved in the process that leads to that moment. They are involved in the response. This is why the texts do not dwell on their inactivity. Inactivity is not their state. Dormancy is. Dormancy implies potential energy. It implies that action is possible without being inevitable. The language surrounding the Anunnaki preserves this potential without activating it. This preservation is subtle. It does not encourage anticipation. It discourages complacency. The Sumerians did not believe that cycles guaranteed repetition. They believed that cycles required maintenance. If maintenance failed, the next cycle would not resemble the last. This is why intervals are often accompanied by new limitations. After the flood, lifespans are reduced. After divine proximity, access is restricted. After kingship descends, succession is regulated. Each interval results in adjustment. These adjustments are not punitive. They are stabilizing. The language that describes them is administrative rather than emotional. Decrees are issued, limits are set, conditions are imposed. There is no sense of regret. There is no promise of reversal. This administrative tone extends to how waiting is handled. Waiting is not lamented. It is accepted as part of order. The gods wait. Humans wait. Systems wait. What matters is not the duration of waiting, but what happens when it ends. This is where cycles and intervals intersect with the concept of return. Return does not mean repetition of the same. It means resumption under altered conditions. A god who returns does not pick up where they left off. They respond to a changed landscape. Their authority remains, but its application is recalibrated. The Anunnaki, when invoked, do not restore a previous state. They assess the present one. This assessment is not narrated because it does not belong to the human domain. Humans experience the outcome, not the deliberation. The language of waiting preserves this asymmetry. It keeps divine action opaque while human experience remains visible. This opacity is not meant to frustrate. It is meant to enforce humility. The Sumerians did not assume that all knowledge was accessible. They assumed that some processes were beyond observation. Waiting acknowledged that limitation. In modern terms, waiting often feels like uncertainty. In the Sumerian framework, waiting is certainty deferred. It is confidence in structure rather than outcome. The texts reflect this confidence. They do not express anxiety about divine silence. They do not demand reassurance. They continue ritual, governance, and daily life as if silence were normal. Silence in this context is not neglect. It is the interval. The interval is where human systems reveal their strength or weakness. It is where order proves whether it can sustain itself. The Anunnaki, associated with judgment, are relevant only at the end of this interval. Their return is not anticipated because anticipation would undermine the test. If humans expected immediate correction, responsibility would collapse. By embedding waiting into the structure, the Sumerians ensured that accountability remained with those acting within the interval. This framework also explains why Sumerian texts resist eschatology. There is no final end. There is no ultimate judgment that resolves everything permanently. There are only cycles, intervals, and responses. Even the underworld is not final in the way later traditions conceive it. It is a domain of continuation, not termination. Judgment assigns fate, but fate operates within a system that persists. This persistence is key. It allows waiting to be meaningful. Waiting only matters if something continues afterward. The language of waiting, therefore, is not passive language. It is structural language. It encodes expectation without promise. The Anunnaki are part of this encoding. Their role is preserved in lists, invocations, and judicial formulas. They are not dramatized because drama would imply immediacy. Immediacy is the opposite of waiting. The texts maintain distance. They resist urgency. They avoid specificity. This avoidance is not weakness. It is design. A system built to last does not exhaust itself explaining every possibility. It preserves mechanisms that can respond to possibilities as they arise. The cycles continue. The intervals hold. The waiting remains intact. And within that waiting, authority does not dissolve. It rests. The Sumerian texts do not tell the reader to watch the sky or count the days. They tell the reader, quietly and consistently, that order exists because it can be corrected. Correction does not announce itself. It arrives when needed. The Anunnaki are not present because presence would imply constant crisis. They are not gone because absence would imply lost authority. They exist in the interval. The language of waiting ensures that this existence remains possible without becoming intrusive. As long as the cycles turn, as long as intervals are respected, waiting continues without disruption. And the texts, by preserving this language so carefully, ensure that waiting is understood not as emptiness, but as readiness, not as fear, but as balance, not as anticipation, but as structure. This is the quiet strength of the Sumerian worldview. It does not rush toward endings. It does not cling to beginnings. It sustains itself through intervals, cycles, and the discipline of waiting. And it is within that discipline that the idea of return remains intact, without ever needing to be declared. When modern readers encounter the word departure in discussions of ancient gods, they instinctively imagine movement, a leaving, a withdrawal that creates absence, something once present that is no longer there. But this assumption does not align with how the Sumerian texts use the idea at all. In the old texts, departure does not describe motion through space, it describes a change in relationship. This distinction is essential, because misunderstanding it leads to almost every later misreading of divine absence in Mesopotamian thought. The Sumerians did not imagine their gods travelling away from the world, as one might leave a city or cross a sea. Gods were not spatially confined in the same way humans were. Their presence was not measured by proximity, but by engagement. A god was present when their function was active. A god was absent when their function was withheld. Nothing more, nothing less. Departure, therefore, does not mean removal. It means disengagement. This is why the texts never describe the gods packing up, ascending permanently to the heavens, or sealing the world behind them. There is no scene of farewell, no final address, no closing of the divine order. Such scenes would imply irreversibility, and irreversibility does not exist in the Sumerian cosmological framework. Instead, what the texts describe is a gradual thinning of interaction. Early in the mythic sequence, gods walk openly among humans. They teach, they argue, they intervene directly. Their decisions are immediate and visible. But as order stabilizes, that proximity becomes unnecessary. The system begins to regulate itself. Human institutions emerge, kingship functions, rituals maintain balance. At that point, constant divine involvement would become interference. So the gods step back. This stepping back is often misread as abandonment, but the texts never frame it that way. They do not say the gods no longer care. They say the gods no longer intervene openly. That difference matters. The Sumerians understood intervention as costly. Every divine action altered the balance of the world. Intervention was not benevolence by default, it was disruption, even when necessary. To intervene constantly would destabilize the system. Thus, departure is a sign of confidence, not neglect. A god who departs has judged that the system can function without immediate oversight. This is why departure often follows moments of major restructuring, such as after the flood or after the establishment of kingship. Once boundaries are set and mechanisms are in place, withdrawal becomes appropriate. This logic mirrors administrative practice. A ruler does not oversee every task personally. Authority is delegated. Oversight becomes indirect. The ruler remains sovereign even when absent from daily affairs. The Sumerians applied this logic to divine governance. When the texts speak of gods returning to the heavens or withdrawing to their domains, they are describing a redistribution of attention, not a severing of authority. The gods remain accessible through ritual, prayer, and omen. They remain bound to their domains. What changes is the frequency and visibility of their action. Departure, therefore, is not the end of influence. It is the beginning of latency. This concept of latency is critical for understanding how the Anunnaki fit into the broader system. The Anunnaki are not described as departing because they are not described as remaining either. Their role exists almost entirely within latency. They are invoked when necessary, otherwise silent. This silence has led some modern interpreters to assume that the Anunnaki were believed to have left permanently. But the texts never say this. They simply stop narrating their activity. Narration is not existence. The Sumerians were acutely aware of this distinction. They understood that silence does not erase authority. In fact, silence often strengthens it. An authority that must constantly assert itself is unstable. An authority that can remain unspoken is secure. This is why certain divine names persist in legal and ritual context long after their myths fade. The myth explained the origin. The ritual preserved the function. Departure, then, marks the transition from mythic presence to institutional presence. This transition is visible across the corpus. Early texts are rich with narrative detail. Later texts are sparse, formulaic, and procedural. This is not a loss of imagination. It is a shift in purpose. The gods no longer need stories. They need roles. Departure also serves another function. It preserves responsibility. As long as gods are visibly present, humans can defer accountability. When gods withdraw, humans must govern, judge, and maintain order themselves. This does not mean the gods are no longer watching. It means humans are no longer shielded from consequence by constant divine correction. This idea appears repeatedly in wisdom literature and hymns. Humans are warned to uphold justice, not because gods are watching every act, but because imbalance accumulates. When imbalance reaches a threshold, correction follows. Departure creates space for accumulation. Without departure, there can be no judgment, only management. Judgment requires distance. It requires observation over time. The Anunnaki, associated with judgment, therefore require departure to function. If they were constantly present, judgment would lose its meaning. It would become routine. Judgment, to be meaningful, must be episodic. This is why the texts do not describe the Anunnaki walking among humans. They do not teach. They do not rule cities. They appear when outcomes are decided. Their absence from daily narrative is not evidence of irrelevance. It is evidence of specialization. Departure, in this sense, is functional. It allows different layers of the divine order to operate without interference. Gods of fertility remain engaged because fertility is continuous. Gods of judgment withdraw because judgment is conditional. This layered presence is not chaotic, it is efficient. The Sumerians did not imagine the cosmos as a place of constant divine drama. They imagined it as a managed system. When management works, supervisors recede. When management fails, supervisors return. This is the administrative logic embedded in the mythological language. Modern interpretations often collapse this logic into a single dramatic event. Gods leave. Gods return. Something catastrophic must have happened. But the Sumerian texts resist this simplification. They describe a continuum of engagement, not a binary switch. Departure can be partial. It can apply to certain functions and not others. A god may withdraw from one domain while remaining active in another. The texts frequently note this without treating it as contradiction. For example, a god may cease to intervene directly in human affairs, but remain active in omens, dreams, or ritual signs. This is not absence, it is redirection. The same applies to collective groups like the Anunnaki. Their presence is felt through fate, through outcome, through irreversible decisions. They do not need narrative presence to exert influence. This is why later cultures could reinterpret them so easily. Without narrative anchors, their role could be reshaped, but within the original Sumerian framework, their function remained intact. Departure also explains why the texts do not frame divine silence as a problem. Silence is expected. It is the default state once order is established. Noise prompts intervention. Silence indicates stability. This is why the flood narrative emphasizes noise as the trigger for catastrophe. Humanity becomes too loud. The gods cannot rest. Silence must be restored. After the flood, measures are introduced to prevent noise from reaching such levels again. Shorter lifespans, population limits, disease. These are not punishments. They are controls. Controls allow departure to persist. If the system can regulate itself, divine withdrawal can continue. If the system fails, withdrawal ends. This conditionality is at the heart of Sumerian cosmology. Nothing is absolute. Everything is contingent on balance. Departure is therefore reversible by design. The texts never say the gods will never return. They also never say they will. They leave the question open because it depends on conditions, not destiny. This openness is unsettling to modern readers who expect clarity. But for the Sumerians, clarity lay in structure, not in prediction. They did not need to know when departure would end. They needed to know what would cause it to end. That knowledge is embedded everywhere. In laws, in hymns, in rituals, in warnings about excess, injustice, and disorder. The Anunnaki, as judges, embody the end of departure. Their involvement signals that the interval is closed. This does not require belief in literal return to be meaningful. It requires recognition that the system contains a corrective phase. Departure creates the space in which human action matters. Return marks the moment when it's evaluated. This evaluation is not described in detail because it is not meant to be anticipated. Anticipation would alter behavior artificially. Instead, the system relies on accumulation of consequence. Departure is therefore not absence of care, it is trust. Trust that humans will govern themselves within established boundaries. Trust that order will hold. Trust that correction remains available if it does not. The texts preserve this trust through restraint. They avoid dramatizing departure. They avoid promising return. They allow the structure to speak for itself. This is why later interpretations that imagine abandonment or exile misrepresent the original intent. The Sumerians did not believe their gods had left them behind. They believed their gods had stepped back. Stepping back is not turning away. It is allowing space. That space is where civilization exists. As long as that space remains within tolerable limits, departure continues. When those limits are exceeded, departure ends. The texts do not say this explicitly. They do not need to. They encode it in silence, in repetition, in preserved roles that wait without fading. Departure, in the old texts, is not a farewell, it is a pause. And like all pauses in the Sumerian worldview, it exists to make what comes after meaningful. Not every sign in the Sumerian text was meant for the moment in which it was written. This is one of the most difficult ideas for modern readers to accept, because it challenges the assumption that ancient writing exists primarily to serve its immediate audience. In the Sumerian tradition, this assumption does not hold. The tablets were not only records, they were deposits. They were placed into time with the expectation that they would be encountered under different conditions by people facing circumstances the original scribes could not fully anticipate. This expectation is not stated openly. It does not need to be. It is visible in how the texts are constructed, preserved, and transmitted. Sumerian scribes were acutely aware that clay outlasts people. A tablet could survive long after the city that produced it collapsed. Fires that destroyed buildings often preserved tablets by firing them harder. Floods buried archives that would later be recovered. The medium itself encouraged long-term thinking. Writing was never temporary. Because of this, signs embedded in the text did not need to function immediately. They needed to remain legible. Legibility in this sense is not about ease of reading. It is about structural recognition. A sign meant for later readers does not explain itself fully, because later readers will bring different context to it. Instead, it preserves relationships. Names are placed in proximity. Roles are listed together. Certain actions are paired with certain outcomes. The sign does not declare its meaning. It maintains a pattern. Patterns are readable across time even when language shifts. This is why many Sumerian signs feel strangely underdeveloped to modern readers. A phrase appears without explanation. A divine group is mentioned without context. A consequence is stated without a cause. These are not omissions. They are intentional compressions. They reduce dependency on contemporary understanding and increase durability. A sign meant for later readers cannot rely on current assumptions. It must survive reinterpretation. This survival is achieved through restraint. When the Sumerians wanted to communicate immediate instruction, they were capable of precision. Administrative texts are exact. Legal documents specify penalties. Ritual instructions list materials and gestures in careful sequence. Nothing is left ambiguous where action must follow immediately. But mythological and cosmological texts behave differently. They leave gaps. They allow silence. They avoid specificity at critical junctions. These are not weaknesses. They are features. A warning meant only for the present can be explicit. A warning meant for the future must be adaptable. The Sumerians understood this intuitively. They had no concept of a single final audience. They lived in a land where cities rose and fell within generations. They had already inherited ruins older than their own civilization. They knew that what they wrote would outlive them. As a result, some signs were planted rather than explained. These signs often appear in transitional contexts, moments where the text shifts from description to structure, from narrative to list, from story to decree. These shifts are subtle, but they mark places where interpretation changes. A sign placed here does not tell the reader what to think. It tells the reader where to look. This becomes especially important in passages that deal with divine oversight. The texts do not say that gods will return. They do not say that they will not. Instead, they preserve the mechanisms by which return would be meaningful. The Anunnaki are part of this mechanism. They appear in contexts that imply evaluation rather than activity. They are named where outcomes are determined, not where processes unfold. This placement is consistent across texts that otherwise differ in style and purpose. Consistency across variation is one of the strongest indicators of intentional signalling. If a name or role appears repeatedly in similar structural positions across centuries, it is not accidental. It means that later scribes recognized its importance even when they didn't expand upon it. This recognition is itself a sign. The scribes were not free to innovate arbitrarily. They worked within traditions governed by temple authorities and inherited curricula. They copied what they were taught to copy. When they preserved certain patterns, they were preserving judgments made long before them. These judgments were not about immediate relevance, they were about systemic necessity. Signs meant for later readers are therefore often the least dramatic. They do not draw attention to themselves. They remain in place quietly, waiting for context to give them meaning. This waiting is not passive. It is anticipatory without expectation. The Sumerians did not attempt to imagine specific futures. They imagined conditions. They understood that future readers would recognize patterns not because those patterns were predicted, but because they would recur. This is why signs often appear as repetitions rather than innovations. A repeated phrase across eras signals continuity of relevance. It tells the reader that whatever this phrase encodes has not been resolved. Resolution would require removal or modification. Preservation implies openness. This logic applies not only to mythological texts, but to king lists, hymns, and legal formulas. Certain phrases remain unchanged even when their immediate political context disappears. Kingship continues to descend from heaven long after dynasties change. Divine authority remains the source of law even when rulers change names and cities shift power. These statements are not historical claims, they are structural assertions. They tell future readers how authority is understood, regardless of who holds it at any given moment. Signs meant for later readers operate at this structural level. They do not predict events, they predict responses. If kingship collapses, it will be restored according to this pattern. If order fails, correction will occur through these mechanisms. If boundaries are crossed, judgment will follow these roles. The Anunnaki, associated with judgment and fate, occupy a crucial position in this predictive structure. They are not described in terms of narrative action, because their relevance is conditional. They are activated by circumstance, not by story. Their continued presence in the texts ensures that the possibility of evaluation remains available. This is a form of warning, but not one that induces fear. It induces awareness. Awareness that systems are not immune, that stability is provisional, that silence does not mean abandonment. Modern readers often mistake this for pessimism or fatalism. It is neither. It is maintenance logic applied to cosmology. A system that cannot be corrected will eventually collapse. A system that preserves its corrective mechanisms can endure. The Sumerians chose endurance. This choice is visible in how signs are distributed. They are not clustered in apocalyptic sections. They are woven into routine texts. They appear where they can be overlooked by those not paying attention. A sign that is too obvious loses its power. It becomes dated. It becomes tied to a specific fear. A sign that is quiet remains flexible. This quietness also protects the sign from misuse. A detailed prophecy invites manipulation. A vague structure resists it. The Sumerians did not want their texts to be used to justify panic or rebellion. They wanted them to preserve order. This intention explains why warnings are embedded in lists rather than proclamations. Lists appear neutral. They present information without argument, but lists also establish hierarchy and relationship. A god listed among judges rather than creators communicates function without explanation. A deity placed at the end of a genealogy signals culmination rather than origin. These placements are signs. They are meant to be noticed by those who understand structure, not by those seeking spectacle. Later cultures often missed this subtlety. They expanded narratives, dramatized figures, and filled silences with stories. These expansions reveal more about later anxieties than about original intent. The Sumerian texts resist this expansion because their signs are not narrative hooks. They are anchors. Anchors do not move, they hold position. The Anunnaki, preserved as anchors of judgment, do not need stories to remain relevant. Their relevance is preserved by their placement. Signs meant for later readers must survive misunderstanding. They must remain intact even when misinterpreted. This is why they are often minimal. Minimal signs cannot be disproven easily. They can be recontextualized endlessly. This does not mean the Sumerians anticipated modern interpretations. It means they anticipated change. They understood that cultures evolve, that languages shift, that meanings drift. They did not attempt to freeze meaning. They froze structure. Structure can be re-inhabited. This is why the texts feel alive even now, not because they speak directly to modern concerns, but because their architecture allows new concerns to pass through them. Signs meant for later readers do not say what will happen. They show how things happen when they do. The difference is critical. Prediction limits interpretation. Structure enables it. The Sumerians chose the latter. This choice is visible in the way they avoided finality. There is no ultimate end, no last judgment that resolves everything permanently. There are only cycles and corrections. Even the underworld is not a terminal destination in the modern sense. It is an assignment. Fate is determined, but existence continues. This continuity requires ongoing oversight. Oversight that cannot be exhausted by a single event. The Anunnaki, as overseers of fate, therefore remain relevant indefinitely. Their presence in the texts is not an announcement. It is a provision for future moments when evaluation is necessary. The scribes who copied these signs did not know when those moments would occur. They did not need to. Their task was to ensure that the system remained complete. Completeness does not require activity. It requires availability. This is why the signs are not framed as urgent. Urgency would tether them to a specific moment. Availability keeps them open. The signs do not demand attention. They wait. Waiting is the common thread across all these elements. Waiting does not mean expectation. It means preparedness without anxiety. The Sumerian worldview is not obsessed with the future. It is committed to balance across time. Signs meant for those who come later are not messages in bottles. They are load-bearing elements of a worldview designed to survive disruption. They ensure that when later readers encounter conditions that resemble earlier ones, the response does not need to be invented. It can be recognized. The Anunnaki do not need to return dramatically to fulfill this function. Their role is already present, preserved in lists, formulas, and silences. As long as those elements exist, the system is complete. The sign has done its work, not by speaking loudly, but by remaining where it was placed, waiting, intact, for those who will eventually understand why it was never explained. The Anunnaki are rarely described as being anywhere in particular. This absence of location is not a gap in the record, it is a defining feature. Unlike other gods in the Sumerian texts, they are not anchored to cities, temples, rivers, or celestial bodies. They do not dwell on mountain tops or beneath specific springs. They are not said to walk among humans, nor are they portrayed as distant rulers constantly observing from above. Their significance does not depend on where they are. It depends on when they are relevant. This distinction between presence and timing is one of the most consistent and most misunderstood aspects of how the Anunnaki function within the Sumerian worldview. Presence implies continuity. It implies visibility. It suggests a role that must be active in order to exist. Timing implies conditionality. It suggests a role that remains dormant until invoked. The Anunnaki belong entirely to the second category. They are not absent because they are irrelevant. They are absent because their relevance is not constant. This is why the texts resist placing them in scenes of daily divine activity. Gods associated with fertility, water, or craftsmanship are described repeatedly because their work never stops. Crops must grow every season. Canals must be maintained. Birth and illness occur without pause. These gods must remain present for the world to function. The Anunnaki are different. Their role is not maintenance. It is assessment. Assessment does not require constant presence. It requires observation over time and intervention at a specific moment. This is why the language surrounding the Anunnaki is temporal rather than spatial. They are invoked at moments of decision, not moments of activity. In many texts, they appear when fate is fixed, when judgment is rendered, or when a transition between states occurs. These are not locations, they are moments. This temporal framing explains why later readers often struggle to visualize the Anunnaki. The texts do not provide imagery because imagery would suggest physicality. Physicality would imply presence. Presence would contradict their function. The Sumerians did not imagine all gods as equally embodied. Some gods were forces that acted continuously within the world. Others were authorities that acted intermittently upon it. The Anunnaki belong to the latter. This is also why they are frequently associated with the underworld without being described as rulers of it, in the same way other gods rule domains. The underworld, in Sumerian thought, is not simply a place, it is a condition. It is the state that follows life. It is a transition rather than a residence. The Anunnaki preside over that transition. They do not inhabit the underworld as a location. They govern the timing of judgment within it. This distinction is subtle, but it resolves many apparent contradictions in the texts. The Anunnaki are sometimes described as being below, sometimes associated with heaven, and sometimes not located at all. This inconsistency disappears once location is understood as secondary to function. Function is temporal. The Sumerians were deeply attuned to timing. Their calendars tracked agricultural cycles. Their rituals were scheduled according to celestial movements. Their festivals marked transitions between seasons rather than fixed anniversaries. Time was not abstract. It was practical. This practical understanding of time extended into their cosmology. Divine action was not random. It occurred when conditions aligned. The Anunnaki are the embodiment of this principle. They do not act because they choose to. They act because the moment requires it. This is why the texts do not describe them watching constantly. Constant watching would imply constant readiness. Constant readiness would imply constant judgment. Constant judgment would collapse the distinction between order and correction. The Sumerians did not live under the assumption of continuous divine surveillance. They lived under the assumption of eventual accountability. Accountability is a matter of timing. The Anunnaki represent the point at which accumulated actions become accessible. Until that point, activity continues without interruption. This is not permissiveness. It is patience. Patience is not absence of authority. It is authority withheld until it matters. This withheld authority is one of the most stable features of the Sumerian system. It allows human societies to function without immediate divine interference, while ensuring that outcomes are not arbitrary. This balance would collapse if the Anunnaki were portrayed as constantly present. Presence invites intervention. Intervention interrupts accumulation. Accumulation is necessary for judgment. This logic appears repeatedly in the flood narrative. The gods do not intervene at the first sign of human excess. They wait. Noise increases, population grows, disruption accumulates. Only when the threshold is crossed does judgment occur. The Anunnaki are associated with that threshold, not with the activity leading up to it. This association explains why they are invoked in lists of judges rather than lists of creators. Creation happens once. Judgment recurs, but it recurs only when needed. Timing, therefore, is the Anunnaki's domain. This also clarifies why later interpretations that imagine the Anunnaki as constant overseers feel discordant with the original texts. A god who is always present must always act. A god who always acts must always justify their action. The Sumerian texts avoid this trap by limiting their involvement to moments of necessity. Necessity is temporal. The texts do not say the Anunnaki are watching everything humans do. They do not say they are absent either. They remain undefined in terms of presence because presence is not the correct frame. Instead, the texts encode their relevance through timing. They appear when decisions are final, when outcomes cannot be reversed, when fate is fixed rather than negotiated. This fixation of fate is not arbitrary. It is the culmination of accumulated conditions. The Anunnaki are not linked to presence because presence would imply immediacy. They are linked to timing because timing implies inevitability. Inevitability, in the Sumerian sense, does not mean destiny unfolding regardless of action. It means that once conditions reach a certain point, response becomes unavoidable. This is a crucial distinction. Fate is not predetermined. Fate is triggered. The Anunnaki are the ones who respond to the trigger. This is why their role remains relevant even when their stories fade. Stories belong to presence. Roles belong to structure. Structure belongs to timing. The scribes understood this difference. They preserved the role without embellishing the presence. They kept the Anunnaki where they belonged, at the level of mechanism rather than narrative. This preservation ensures that their function cannot be exhausted by a single event. A god whose role is tied to timing can act multiple times without contradiction. Each act responds to a different accumulation of conditions. This is also why the texts never describe a final judgment administered by the Anunnaki. A final judgment would end the need for timing, it would close the system. The Sumerian worldview does not allow closure of that kind. There is always another interval, another accumulation, another assessment. This openness is not uncertainty, it is continuity. The Anunnaki's lack of presence also prevents them from becoming objects of devotion in the same way other gods do. They are not gods one petitions for rain or fertility. They are not gods one seeks favour from in daily life. Petition implies immediacy. Favour implies exchange. Judgment does not operate on exchange. It operates on evaluation. This further reinforces their association with timing rather than presence. One does not summon judgment prematurely. One prepares for it by maintaining balance. The texts reflect this attitude. They do not instruct humans to appease the Anunnaki directly. They instruct humans to uphold order, justice, moderation, proper ritual. These behaviours reduce the likelihood that judgment will be required. This is not fear-based obedience. It is system-based responsibility. The Anunnaki function as the final check within that system. Their role does not need to be visible to be effective. In fact, visibility would undermine their function. A visible judge invites performance. An invisible judge encourages consistency. The Sumerians valued consistency. Their laws emphasize fairness, proportionality, and precedent. These principles align with delayed judgment rather than immediate punishment. Delayed judgment requires patience. Patience requires trust in timing. The Anunnaki embody that trust. This trust extends to how the texts handle divine silence. Silence is not absence of authority. It is evidence that the interval is still open, that accumulation is ongoing, that judgment has not yet been triggered. This silence is often misread by modern audiences as abandonment or indifference. Within the Sumerian framework, it is neither. It is the default state. The default state is waiting. Waiting does not mean that nothing is happening. It means that everything is happening without immediate correction. It allows systems to reveal their tendencies. The Anunnaki intervene only when those tendencies produce imbalance beyond tolerance. This tolerance is not infinite. It is calibrated. Calibration is temporal. The texts never specify exact thresholds. They do not quantify excess. They do not define precise limits. This vagueness is intentional. Specific thresholds would invite manipulation. Structural thresholds cannot be gamed. By linking judgment to timing rather than presence, the Sumerians ensured that accountability could not be evaded through performance. One could not behave well only when watched. One had to maintain balance continuously. This is a sophisticated moral framework. It does not rely on constant surveillance. It relies on eventual assessment. The Anunnaki are the mechanism of that assessment. This mechanism remains relevant regardless of cultural change. Even as cities fall and gods are renamed, the idea that actions accumulate consequences persists. This persistence explains why the Anunnaki remain embedded in the texts long after their narrative presence fades. Their relevance does not depend on story, it depends on structure. Structure outlasts story. This is also why later cultures could reinterpret the Anunnaki so freely. When a role is preserved without imagery, it becomes a canvas for projection. But the original function remains detectable beneath those projections. The original function is timing. The Anunnaki are not beings one encounters, they are moments one reaches. This reframing dissolves many modern anxieties about their supposed return. Return implies presence after absence. But within the Sumerian framework, return is not spatial. It is temporal. Return happens when waiting ends. Waiting ends when balance fails. Balance fails when accumulation crosses a threshold. This chain does not require belief in gods. It requires recognition of system behavior. The Sumerians encoded this behavior into their cosmology, because cosmology was their language for system-wide thinking. The Anunnaki are not anomalies within that system. They are its safeguard. Safeguards are not active until needed. Their effectiveness depends on remaining intact during periods of inactivity. This is why the texts do not elaborate on their absence. Absence is their normal state. Their presence would be the anomaly. This inversion is difficult for modern readers accustomed to dramatic narratives. We expect significance to be visible. The Sumerians expected significance to be structural. The Anunnaki are linked to timing because timing is the only dimension in which their role makes sense. Presence would reduce them to characters. Timing preserves them as function. This function does not need constant affirmation. It needs continuity. The scribes ensured that continuity by copying names, preserving lists, and maintaining silence where explanation would weaken authority. They did not need to predict a return. They needed to preserve the conditions under which return would be meaningful. Those conditions are embedded everywhere, in warnings against excess, in emphasis on justice, in reminders that kingship is conditional, in acknowledgements that order can be corrected. The Anunnaki are the quiet endpoint of those reminders. They do not hover, they do not watch, they do not intrude, they wait. And in Sumerian thought, waiting is not empty time. It is the interval in which everything that matters is decided, not by immediate intervention, but by accumulation. And when accumulation reaches its limit, timing replaces presence. That is when the Anunnaki matter. Not before, not always, but precisely when they are needed. And that precision is the reason they remain quietly intact across the long span of the texts, without ever requiring the world to see them in order to be shaped by the possibility of their judgment. Humanity, in the Sumerian worldview, is not positioned at the centre of cosmic drama, nor is it treated as a passive audience waiting for divine action. Instead, humanity occupies the long stretch between appearances, the interval, the span of time where the gods are not visibly intervening, where judgment has not yet been enacted, and where outcomes are still forming. This space is not empty. It is the most consequential part of the system. Between appearances, humans are not being watched constantly, but they are not ignored either. They are operating within a framework that has already been established. The gods have acted. Boundaries have been set. Mechanisms exist. What remains is not divine presence, but responsibility. This is one of the most misunderstood aspects of Sumerian thought. Modern interpretations often assume that divine absence implies neglect, abandonment, or disinterest. The Sumerian texts do not support this. Divine absence is purposeful. It creates room for human systems to function without interference. It allows cause and effect to unfold fully. Humanity's role during this interval is not to anticipate return, but to maintain balance. The texts do not instruct humans to prepare for divine appearances in a dramatic sense. There are no rituals designed to summon the Anunnaki. No prayers asking for their return, no expectation that their involvement is desirable. On the contrary, their appearance is associated with judgment, finality, and irreversible decisions. This is not something to be invited. The desired state is continuation without interruption. This places humanity in an unusual position. Humans are not caretakers of the gods, nor are they merely servants awaiting orders. They are operators of a system that has been handed to them provisionally. Kings govern, priests perform rituals, farmers manage land, judges resolve disputes. All of this happens without constant divine correction. This autonomy is not absolute. It exists within limits. Those limits are not enforced daily. They are enforced when necessary. This is where the role of humanity becomes critical. Humans are not judged on isolated actions. They are assessed on patterns. Accumulation matters. Repetition matters. Scale matters. The Sumerian texts repeatedly emphasize noise, excess, imbalance, and disruption as triggers for divine response. These are collective conditions, not individual sins. The system is not concerned with private morality in the modern sense. It is concerned with sustainability. Humanity, therefore, is responsible for maintaining conditions that do not force correction. This responsibility is distributed, not centralized. No single human action triggers divine judgment. It is the cumulative effect of many actions over time. This makes humanity's role both powerful and precarious. Powerful because humans are not micromanaged. Precarious because they cannot rely on immediate correction. The interval between divine appearances is where human systems either prove resilient or reveal their flaws. It is where institutions are tested without intervention. Laws are applied without divine override. Leadership succeeds or fails without miraculous rescue. This is why Sumerian texts place so much emphasis on kingship, justice, and proper order. These are not merely social concerns, they are cosmic ones. Kingship is not sacred because it flatters rulers. It is sacred because it is the primary mechanism by which order is maintained in the absence of gods. When kings fail, it is not merely political failure, it is structural failure. The Anunnaki do not appear to correct minor injustice. They appear when systemic imbalance has reached a point where internal mechanisms can no longer compensate. This makes humanity's role between appearances deeply consequential. Humans are not waiting for salvation. They are responsible for preventing catastrophe. The texts make this clear through omission rather than instruction. There are no divine lectures outlining humanity's duties in exhaustive detail. Instead, there are repeated reminders of consequence. Flood narratives, collapses of dynasties, cities abandoned. These are not punishments for disbelief. They are outcomes of imbalance. The flood, in particular, illustrates this logic. Humanity does not fail because it disobeys a commandment. It fails because it overwhelms the system. Population grows, activity increases, noise rises. The gods cannot rest. The system becomes unsustainable. This is not a moral indictment. It is a logistical one. After the flood, the gods do not withdraw entirely. They restructure. Lifespans are reduced. Population growth is regulated. Disease is introduced. These are not acts of cruelty. They are controls designed to make human operations sustainable over longer intervals. This restructuring reinforces humanity's role. Humans are not meant to reach unchecked expansion. They are meant to exist within limits. Between appearances, humanity is not judged continuously, but it is always accumulating consequences. This accumulation is invisible in the short term. Cities prosper, trade expands, technology advances. But beneath this surface, thresholds are approached. The system absorbs stress until it cannot. The Anunnaki appear when absorption fails. This is why the texts do not encourage humanity to focus on divine return. Fixation on return would distract from the actual responsibility, which is maintenance. The Sumerians did not live in expectation of apocalypse. They lived with awareness of limits. This awareness shaped their rituals. Offerings were made not to summon gods but to maintain balance. Festivals mark transitions, not climaxes. Omens were interpreted as indicators of system health, not messages of doom. Humanity's role was interpretive as much as operational. Signs were not warnings of inevitable events, they were diagnostics. This diagnostic role placed humans in a position of active participation. They were expected to read the environment, interpret signs, adjust behaviour, and maintain equilibrium. Divine appearance signalled failure of this process. This reframes the entire concept of return. Return is not a fulfillment of expectation, it is a corrective intervention. Humanity's role between appearances is therefore to make return unnecessary. This does not mean humans can prevent all correction indefinitely. It means they can extend the interval. The length of the interval is not predetermined. It depends on how well human systems function. This makes humanity's role dynamic. It changes as conditions change. What maintains balance in one era may fail in another. The system must adapt. The Sumerian texts reflect this adaptability. Laws are revised, rituals evolve, kingship changes form. But the underlying structure remains. The Anunnaki remain at the edge of this structure, not as overseers, but as enforcers of ultimate correction. Humanity exists in the space where enforcement has not yet occurred. This space is where meaning is generated. Without this interval, human action would be meaningless. Immediate correction would eliminate consequence. Humans would become functionaries rather than agents. The Sumerians did not imagine humanity as powerless. They imagined humanity as entrusted. This trust is evident in the absence of constant divine intervention. It is also evident in the severity of correction when it finally occurs. Trust increases responsibility. This responsibility is collective. Individual virtue does not save a system. Collective imbalance condemns it. This is why Sumerian texts often treat humanity as a group rather than as individuals. The concern is not personal salvation, it is civilizational sustainability. The role of humanity between appearances is to function as a system capable of self-regulation. When self-regulation fails, external regulation resumes. The Anunnaki represent that external regulation. This does not require belief in literal beings to remain meaningful. It describes a principle. Systems are allowed autonomy until they demonstrate they cannot manage it. The Sumerians encoded this principle into myth because myth was their language for systemic truth. Modern readers often project individual psychology onto these texts. Fear, guilt, hope. But the texts are not primarily psychological. They are organizational. They describe how large systems behave over time. Humanity's role is not to be perfect, it is to be sustainable. This sustainability is threatened by excess, not by ignorance. Knowledge alone does not prevent collapse. Restraint does. The texts emphasize moderation, justice, proper measure. These are not moral virtues in isolation. They are stabilizing practices. Kings are warned against arrogance. Cities are warned against overexpansion. Rituals are designed to align human activity with cosmic rhythm. Between appearances, humanity is expected to align itself. Alignment is not obedience, it is synchronization. The Sumerians did not believe humans needed to obey divine commands blindly. They believed humans needed to operate in harmony with established order. Harmony reduces stress on the system. Stress accumulates silently. This silent accumulation is why the interval can feel deceptive. Everything appears stable until it is not. The Anunnaki do not interrupt early because interruption would prevent learning. Learning requires consequence. Humanity learns through collapse as much as through continuity. This is not cruelty, it is realism. The texts do not lament divine absence. They assume it. They do not celebrate divine return. They endure it. Humanity's role between appearances is therefore neither passive nor heroic. It is managerial. Humans manage land, law, labour and life within boundaries set long ago. They do so without constant oversight. This autonomy is both a gift and a burden. The burden is that failure is not immediately corrected. The gift is that success is genuine. The Sumerians valued genuine success. They did not imagine a world where gods did everything. They imagined a world where gods established conditions and humans operated within them. This operation is where culture emerges: writing, law, trade, architecture. These are human achievements made possible by divine withdrawal. Without withdrawal, humanity would never develop independent systems. This perspective challenges modern assumptions that divine absence is a problem. In the Sumerian worldview, divine absence is what makes civilization possible. The Anunnaki's distance is not threatening, it is enabling. Their return is not salvation, it is correction. This inversion is crucial. Humanity's role is not to wait for correction, it is to delay it. Delay is achieved through balance. Balance is achieved through restraint. Restraint is not weakness, it is intelligence applied to system management. The Sumerians understood this deeply. Their texts do not instruct humanity to fear the gods. They instruct humanity to respect limits. Limits are not arbitrary. They exist because systems have capacity. Exceed capacity and correction follows. This is true of rivers, fields, cities and societies. The Anunnaki represent the final check when capacity is exceeded. Humanity operates between checks. This is the interval. The interval is where choice matters. Not because gods are watching, but because consequences accumulate regardless of observation. This understanding removes urgency and replaces it with responsibility. The texts do not say when the Anunnaki will appear. They do not say if they will appear. They say what happens when systems fail. Humanity's task is to ensure systems do not fail catastrophically. This task never ends. It does not end with one generation. It does not end with one king. It does not end with one city. This is why the Sumerians preserved their texts so carefully. They were not preserving stories, they were preserving frameworks for responsibility. Humanity, between appearances, inherits that framework. Whether one believes in gods or not is irrelevant to the structure. The structure operates regardless. Between appearances, humanity is alone in the sense that it must act without immediate correction. But it is not abandoned. The system remains intact. Judgment remains possible. Correction remains available. This knowledge does not create fear. It creates seriousness. The Sumerians did not live anxiously awaiting divine return. They lived carefully, aware that order is fragile, autonomy is conditional, and correction, when it comes, is never arbitrary. Humanity's role between appearances is to make the interval worth having, not by perfection, but by balance. And that, more than any prophecy or prediction, is the quiet burden embedded in the old texts, waiting patiently in the space where gods are not visible and human action finally matters most. There is a point in the Sumerian textual tradition where devotion changes character. The gods do not disappear, temples do not vanish, and ritual does not end. But the emphasis shifts. Worship, as a primary response to divine authority, gives way to something quieter and more demanding. Preparation. This shift is not announced. It is not framed as reform. It emerges through a mission. Certain expectations fade. Certain appeals are no longer made. The texts stop urging constant appeasement and begin emphasizing readiness. Not readiness for divine favour, but readiness for consequence. In earlier layers of myth, worship is transactional, offerings are made, praise is sung, gods respond visibly, success follows devotion, failure follows neglect. This structure mirrors a world where divine presence is immediate and intervention is frequent. But as divine presence recedes, this transactional logic weakens. The texts no longer suggest that ritual alone can prevent disruption. Offerings continue, but their purpose changes. They are no longer depicted as tools to influence divine mood. They become practices of alignment. Alignment replaces persuasion. This is a subtle but profound change. To persuade is to assume the gods are actively listening and willing to be swayed. To align is to assume the gods are distant, impartial, and bound to structure rather than sentiment. The Sumerians did not abandon worship, they redefined its function. Preparation, in this context, does not mean anticipation of divine arrival. It means maintenance of systems so that arrival, if it occurs, is not catastrophic. Worship becomes a way of sustaining order rather than securing protection. This shift is visible in how the texts describe divine judgment. Earlier narratives emphasize appeasement. Later texts emphasize inevitability. Judgment is not something that can be avoided through praise alone. It can only be delayed or mitigated through balance. Balance requires preparation. Preparation involves law, justice, restraint, and moderation. It is not dramatic. It does not produce immediate results. It accumulates slowly, just as imbalance does. This accumulation is central to the Sumerian worldview. Just as excess accumulates consequence, restraint accumulates stability. The Anunnaki are never portrayed as being impressed by devotion. They are associated with assessment, not admiration. They respond to condition, not ceremony. This does not mean ceremony is irrelevant. It means ceremony must reflect reality. A ritual performed in a city governed unjustly does not restore balance. A hymn sung over a system collapsing under its own excess does not prevent correction. The texts make this clear without stating it directly. They continue to prescribe ritual, but they increasingly emphasize proper order in human affairs. Kings are admonished to rule justly. Judges are warned against corruption. Cities are measured by their sustainability rather than their piety. Preparation replaces worship when worship is no longer sufficient. This does not reflect cynicism. It reflects maturity. A system that relies solely on appeasement is fragile. It collapses when appeasement fails. A system built on preparation endures even when divine silence persists. The Sumerians understood this distinction. They lived in a land where floods could not be prayed away indefinitely. Canals had to be maintained. Fields had to be managed. Laws had to be enforced. Divine favour alone did not keep a city alive. The gods, in withdrawing, forced humanity to confront this reality. This confrontation is visible in the way later texts treat divine warning. The warning is no longer a threat of punishment. It is a reminder of limits. Those limits cannot be negotiated away. They must be respected. Preparation is respect translated into action. This is why the texts stop emphasizing dramatic omens as calls for worship and begin treating them as indicators requiring adjustment. An eclipse is not a sign to panic. It is a signal to review, to correct, to prepare. This diagnostic approach reflects a worldview where divine communication is indirect. The gods do not shout, they signal. Humans are expected to interpret and respond responsibly. This expectation elevates human agency. It also increases accountability. Preparation is not passive. It requires foresight. It requires restraint before crisis occurs. It requires willingness to limit growth even when growth is profitable. The Sumerians were acutely aware of this tension. Their cities thrived on expansion, trade, and population growth. These same factors also increased vulnerability. Preparation required saying no to unchecked expansion. This is why the texts often frame divine correction as inevitable once limits are crossed. Once capacity is exceeded, no amount of worship can reverse the outcome. The only effective response is prevention. Prevention requires preparation long before warning becomes visible. This logic explains why later texts place such heavy emphasis on wisdom. Wisdom is not knowledge of divine secrets. It is understanding of limits. It is the ability to recognize when restraint is required. The Anunnaki, associated with fate and judgment, embody the consequences of failing to prepare. Their involvement signals that preparation has ended and assessment has begun. This is not a moment to worship. It is a moment to endure. The texts do not encourage humans to seek the favour of the Anunnaki. They encourage humans to live in a way that never requires their intervention. This is a striking inversion of later religious frameworks that emphasize constant devotion as a safeguard. In the Sumerian worldview, devotion without preparation is insufficient. Preparation is ethical. It is legal. It is administrative. It manifests in fair taxation, sustainable agriculture, controlled population growth, and respect for boundaries. These are not spiritual practices in the narrow sense. They are systemic practices. The gods withdraw precisely so that these practices must stand on their own. This withdrawal is not abandonment. It is delegation. Delegation implies trust. Trust implies responsibility. Responsibility implies preparation. This chain is embedded everywhere in the texts. The more the gods recede, the more responsibility shifts to human institutions. Temples become administrative centres. Priests become managers of resources. Kings become guarantors of order rather than divine favourites. Worship remains, but it becomes quieter, less emotional, more procedural. Hymns praise gods for establishing order rather than for intervening constantly. Prayers ask for clarity rather than rescue. This change reflects a deep confidence in structure. The Sumerians did not believe that chaos was always imminent. They believed chaos emerged when systems were neglected. Preparation is the antidote to neglect. This is why the texts emphasize continuity over spectacle. They do not celebrate miracles, they celebrate maintenance. Maintenance is not inspiring in the modern sense. It does not produce stories, but it produces longevity. The Anunnaki are the reminder of what happens when maintenance fails. They are not invoked in moments of hope. They are invoked in moments of finality. Preparation aims to keep those moments rare. This aim reshapes worship. Worship becomes a practice of remembering limits rather than asking for exceptions. The gods are no longer treated as negotiators. They are treated as enforcers of structure. This treatment changes the emotional tone of religion. Fear gives way to seriousness. Awe gives way to discipline. The Sumerians did not abandon reverence. They refined it. Reverence becomes respect for order rather than fascination with power. This respect is expressed through preparation, through planning, through moderation. It is expressed through laws that prevent exploitation, through rituals that reinforce restraint, through education that transmits responsibility. The scribes play a critical role here. By preserving texts that emphasize structure rather than spectacle, they reinforce preparation across generations. They do not encourage people to wait for divine return. They encourage people to live as if return is unnecessary. This does not eliminate the possibility of return. It postpones it. Postponement is success in the Sumerian worldview. Success is not eternal stability. It is prolonged balance. Preparation replaces worship because worship alone cannot sustain balance indefinitely. The gods withdraw to test whether humans can manage the world they have been given. The answer is never permanent. It must be renewed each generation. This renewal does not require new revelation. It requires recommitment to limits. The Anunnaki do not demand praise. They demand alignment. Alignment is achieved through preparation. Preparation is invisible when it works. Cities thrive quietly. Order persists. Crisis is avoided. When preparation fails, worship intensifies, but too late. The texts do not condemn worship. They contextualize it. Worship without preparation is noise. Preparation without worship is order. The Sumerians valued order more than noise. This valuation is embedded deeply in their texts. It is why divine silence is not treated as a problem. Silence indicates that preparation is still holding. When silence ends, it is not because worship ceased. It is because preparation failed. This distinction is crucial for understanding the warning embedded in the texts. The warning is not that the gods will return. The warning is that systems have limits. Those limits cannot be prayed away. They can only be respected. Preparation is how respect is expressed. This is the point at which the Sumerian worldview becomes uncomfortable for modern readers. It does not promise salvation through belief. It demands responsibility through action. The gods are not portrayed as rescuers. They are portrayed as regulators. Regulation is not emotional. It is procedural. This procedural approach strips worship of its magical quality and replaces it with discipline. Discipline is harder to sustain than devotion. Devotion flares. Discipline endures. The Sumerians understood this difference. Their texts are not calls to constant prayer. They are manuals for endurance. When preparation replaces worship, religion becomes governance. Governance is slow. It is imperfect. It is vulnerable to corruption. This vulnerability is acknowledged. It is why judgment remains possible. The Anunnaki remain at the edge of the system, not as objects of devotion, but as reminders of consequence. Their distance is intentional. Their silence is functional. Their potential return is not a hope or a fear. It is a contingency. Preparation exists to manage contingencies. This management is never complete. It requires vigilance without anxiety. The Sumerians did not expect perfection. They expected effort. Effort accumulates stability. Stability delays correction. Delay is the measure of success. This is why the texts do not end with triumph. They do not conclude with resolution. They continue. Preparation is ongoing. Worship continues, but it no longer dominates. It supports preparation rather than replacing it. This quiet reorientation is one of the most important shifts in the Sumerian tradition, and one of the easiest to miss. It does not announce itself. It simply happens. And once it happens, the role of humanity becomes clear. Humans are no longer appealing to the gods to manage the world for them. They are managing the world so that the gods do not need to. This is not rebellion. It is trust tested over time. And it is within this trust, stretched across long intervals of silence, that the possibility of return remains intact, not as a threat, but as a final measure reserved for moments when preparation has finally been exhausted. Warnings do not survive unchanged. This is one of the quiet realities embedded in the Sumerian tradition, even though it is never stated directly. A warning that remains active over long periods of time cannot stay sharp forever. It cannot retain the same urgency, the same clarity of purpose, or the same relationship to lived experience. As conditions change, as generations pass, the warning either adapts or dissolves. In the Sumerian texts, this process does not result in disappearance, it results in myth. This transformation is not corruption, it is transmission under pressure. A warning is designed to function within a specific structure. It assumes shared assumptions, lived conditions, and a collective understanding of cause and consequence. When those assumptions erode, the warning does not vanish. It loses immediacy. Its language begins to drift. Its function becomes symbolic rather than operational. This is how warnings become myths. In their earliest forms, Sumerian warnings are embedded in administrative logic. Excess leads to correction. Noise provokes response. Imbalance accumulates consequence. These are not metaphors. They are system descriptions. They describe how large-scale order behaves under strain. But as generations pass, the lived memory of those systems fades. Cities change shape. Institutions are reorganized. Technologies evolve. The original conditions that made the warning immediately legible no longer exist. At that point, the warning does not stop being copied. It stops being understood in its original terms. When understanding fades, interpretation begins. Interpretation fills gaps with narrative. Narrative turns structure into story. Story becomes myth. This process is visible across the Sumerian corpus when comparing early and later treatments of the same material. Early texts are restrained, procedural, and unemotional. Later retellings introduce characters, motivations, conflicts, and resolutions. What was once a framework becomes a drama. The warning survives, but it changes shape. This change is not malicious, it is inevitable. A warning that is no longer experienced as relevant cannot remain purely functional. To persist, it must be reframed in a way that remains engaging. Myth is the vehicle for that reframing. Myth preserves relevance by sacrificing precision. The Sumerians did not resist this process. They allowed it. They continued to copy texts even as interpretation shifted. They did not attempt to freeze meaning. They preserved material and accepted that meaning would evolve. This acceptance is one of the most sophisticated aspects of their tradition. They understood that meaning is temporal. Structure is not. Structure can survive reinterpretation. Meaning cannot. Warnings are part of structure. Myths are part of meaning. When warnings become myths, they are no longer instructions. They become reminders. Reminders do not tell people what to do. They tell people that something matters. The Anunnaki illustrate this transformation clearly. In early texts, their role is administrative and restrained. They are associated with judgment, fate, and final assessment. Their presence signals that a threshold has been crossed. This is a warning mechanism. But as time passes, as the lived experience of large-scale collapse recedes, this mechanism loses immediacy. People no longer see judgment as something that emerges from accumulated imbalance. They begin to imagine it as something imposed by beings with personalities and intentions. The Anunnaki become characters. Characters invite stories. Stories invite embellishment. Embellishment replaces function. This does not erase the warning, it relocates it. Instead of functioning as a system constraint, the warning becomes a narrative lesson. Instead of regulating behavior through structure, it regulates behavior through symbolism. Symbolism is less precise, but more portable. A story about gods punishing excess can travel farther than an administrative description of systemic collapse. It can be told to children. It can be adapted to new cultures. It can survive translation. In this way, myth is not the enemy of warning. It is its long-term survival strategy. However, myth also weakens warning in specific ways. Myth personalizes consequence. It attributes collapse to divine anger rather than systemic failure. This shifts responsibility away from human behavior and toward divine temperament. In early Sumerian thought, the gods do not punish out of emotion, they respond to conditions. In mythic retellings, gods become angry, jealous, or offended. These emotional frames make stories compelling, but they obscure the original logic. The warning shifts from "this system cannot sustain unlimited growth" to "the gods became displeased." This shift matters. When warning becomes myth, humans begin to focus on appeasement rather than prevention. They try to manage divine mood instead of managing systemic limits. This is where the original function begins to erode. The Sumerian texts themselves preserve evidence of this erosion. Later hymns emphasize praise and devotion more heavily. Later myths dramatize divine conflict. The administrative clarity of earlier material gives way to emotional narrative, and yet beneath this narrative layer the structure remains. The Anunnaki are still associated with judgment. Fate is still fixed rather than negotiated. Return is still conditional rather than promised. These elements survive because they belong to structure, not story. The warning persists, but it is now encoded in mythic form. Myth, however, is ambiguous. It allows multiple interpretations. This ambiguity is both strength and weakness. It allows the warning to adapt to new contexts, but it also allows it to be misunderstood. As myths spread beyond their original cultural environment, they detach further from their original function. New audiences do not share the same assumptions about governance, limitation, or system behavior. They read myth as entertainment, theology, or moral instruction rather than a structural description. This detachment accelerates transformation. The warning becomes symbolic rather than practical. This does not mean it disappears. It becomes latent. Latent warnings are dangerous in a different way. They are harder to recognize when conditions repeat. When a society encounters familiar patterns of excess, imbalance, or overexpansion, a functional warning would trigger adjustment. A mythic warning triggers storytelling. Storytelling does not prevent collapse. This may explain why the Sumerian tradition emphasizes preservation over reinterpretation. The scribes continue to copy older, less dramatized texts, alongside newer, more narrative ones. They do not discard the restrained versions. They allow both to coexist. This coexistence preserves the possibility that later readers might recover the original logic. Recovery is not guaranteed. It is possible. This possibility is itself part of the warning. Warnings that become myths are not gone. They are sleeping. They wait for conditions where reinterpretation gives way to recognition. When societies experience collapse that mirrors ancient patterns, myths can suddenly feel relevant again. The emotional narratives recede. The structural lesson re-emerges. This cycle has occurred repeatedly throughout history. Civilizations rise, expand, strain their systems, collapse, and then rediscover ancient warnings embedded in mythic form. Each rediscovery reframes the myth as prophecy. Prophecy in this context is a misunderstanding. The myth did not predict the collapse. The structure described it. This distinction is subtle, but it is critical. The Sumerians did not write prophecies. They wrote descriptions of how systems behave over time. When later readers treat these descriptions as predictions, they invert cause and effect. This inversion leads to anxiety rather than responsibility. Anxiety focuses on waiting for events. Responsibility focuses on managing conditions. The original warning focused on the latter. When warnings become myths, this focus is lost. The Anunnaki become figures of fear rather than mechanisms of assessment. Return becomes anticipated rather than avoided. This shift marks a deep misunderstanding of the original framework. The Sumerian texts do not encourage anticipation of return. They encourage maintenance of balance so that return remains unnecessary. Myth reverses this logic. It turns return into destiny rather than contingency. This is not a flaw in myth, it is a limitation. Myth simplifies complex systems into narrative arcs. Narrative arcs require beginnings, climaxes, and endings. The Sumerian worldview resists endings. There is no final judgment. There is no ultimate resolution. There are only cycles and corrections. Myth struggles to accommodate this openness. It seeks closure. In seeking closure, myth introduces finality where none exists. This finality can be comforting, it can also be misleading. Warnings that become myths lose their ability to regulate behavior over time. They become moral tales rather than operational guides. This is why societies often repeat mistakes despite having myths that seem to warn against them. The warning is no longer functioning at the level it was designed to operate. The Sumerians anticipated this problem, even if they did not articulate it explicitly. They preserved lists. They preserved names without stories. They preserved silence where explanation would harden interpretation. These elements resist mythologization. They remain abstract, institutional, and difficult to dramatize. The Anunnaki's lack of detailed narrative protect their original function. They do not lend themselves easily to storytelling. This resistance is intentional. By preserving certain warnings in non-narrative form, the Sumerians ensured that not all structure would be absorbed into myth. Some parts would remain stubbornly opaque. These opaque elements function as anchors. They prevent complete narrative drift. They allow later readers to sense that something has been lost or simplified. This sensing can prompt re-evaluation. When readers encounter a myth and notice inconsistencies, gaps, or silences, they may suspect that the story is not the whole truth. This suspicion opens space for structural reading. Structural reading recovers warning. Thus, myth does not destroy warning entirely, it obscures it temporarily. The obscuration lasts as long as conditions remain tolerable. When conditions deteriorate, obscured warnings regain clarity. This dynamic is not unique to Sumer. It appears in many ancient traditions. What makes the Sumerian case distinctive is how explicitly the texts preserve both forms. They allow warnings to become myths, but they also preserve the warning beneath the myth. This preservation suggests an awareness that meaning changes, but structure endures. The scribes did not attempt to prevent mythologization. They accepted it as inevitable. They focused instead on preserving the raw material. This raw material includes names, roles, lists, and procedural language. These elements do not entertain. They endure. Endurance is the goal. Warnings that endure must survive misunderstanding. Myths are misunderstandings that allow survival. The Anunnaki's transformation into mythic figures in later traditions is therefore not evidence of deception or corruption. It is evidence that the warning outlived its original context. The danger arises when myth is mistaken for instruction. When people respond to myth with devotion rather than preparation, the warning's effectiveness declines. The Sumerian texts do not instruct readers to worship the Anunnaki. They instruct readers to respect limits. This instruction is easier to miss when wrapped in myth. The task of later readers, then, is not to strip away myth entirely, but to recognize what function it serves. Myth preserves memory when warning loses immediacy. It keeps the shape of consequence alive, but it does not teach prevention. Prevention must be rediscovered. Rediscovery requires attention to structure. This is why lists matter. This is why silence matters. This is why certain names remain unexplained. They point away from story and back towards system. When warnings become myths over time, the responsibility shifts. No longer can the text regulate behaviour automatically. The reader must work harder. The reader must ask not what the story says, but what conditions it describes. This shift in reading is itself part of the warning. It separates those who consume myth from those who interpret structure. The Sumerians did not expect everyone to interpret structure. They expected enough people to preserve it. Preservation does not require understanding. Understanding can come later. The Anunnaki's role as judges survives mythologization because judgment is a concept that cannot be fully narrativized. Stories can describe punishment, but judgment implies evaluation beyond narrative. Evaluation requires context. Context changes. This makes judgment resistant to mythic closure. As long as societies face limits, judgment remains relevant. This relevance ensures that even mythic versions of the warning retain a trace of their original function. They may no longer regulate behaviour directly, but they unsettle complacency. They introduce unease. Unease prompts inquiry. Inquiry can lead back to structure. This is the long arc of warning becoming myth, and myth becoming warning again. It is not linear, it does not conclude, it cycles, just as the Sumerian worldview suggests it would. Warnings do not end, they transform, they sleep, they wait. And when conditions align, they re-emerge, not as prophecies fulfilled, but as structures recognized too late to ignore. The Sumerians understood this process intuitively. They did not try to stop it. They built for it. They left behind texts that could be misunderstood, reinterpreted, mythologized, and still remain intact enough to be read again. This is not failure. It is foresight. Warnings that become myths over time have not failed. They have simply moved into a quieter mode of existence. They remain present, not as instructions shouted across generations, but as frameworks embedded deep enough to survive being forgotten. And in that forgetting, they wait, not for belief, but for conditions to make their original meaning visible once more. A warning that is cancelled leaves traces. It ends with a declaration, a reversal. a reassurance that the condition it addressed no longer applies. In the Sumerian texts, such cancellations are rare, and when they occur, they are explicit. Decrees are amended, limits are imposed, adjustments are recorded, the system is updated, and the text reflects that update clearly. But when it comes to the warnings associated with judgment, excess, and correction, something striking happens. There is no record of cancellation. This absence is not dramatic. It is administrative. The texts do not say that judgment has been completed permanently. They do not say that the conditions which triggered past correction will never arise again. They do not say that the mechanisms of assessment have been dismantled. Instead, they continue to preserve the same structures, the same roles, and the same conditional logic across centuries of copying. This raises a difficult implication. If a warning is never cancelled, it does not mean that it is always active. It means that it remains applicable. Applicability is not urgency. It is availability. The Sumerians understood this distinction well. Their world was governed by rules that did not need to be invoked constantly to remain valid. Laws applied whether or not they were being enforced at a given moment. Boundaries existed whether or not they were being tested. Authority persisted whether or not it was exercised visibly. A warning that is never cancelled functions in the same way. It does not hover over daily life as a threat. It sits quietly in the background as a condition that can be triggered. This is uncomfortable for modern readers, because modern warnings are usually tied to timelines, evacuations, alerts, deadlines. When the event passes, the warning expires. The Sumerian warning does not behave like this because it is not tied to a single event. It is tied to a pattern. Patterns do not expire. The flood narrative illustrates this clearly. After the flood, adjustments are made. Human lifespans are reduced. Population growth is regulated. Disease and mortality are introduced. These changes address the immediate problem. But the mechanism of correction itself is not dismantled. The texts do not say that another flood is impossible. They say that conditions have been altered to make recurrence less likely. Less likely is not impossible. This is the difference between mitigation and cancellation. Mitigation assumes that the underlying risk remains. Cancellation assumes that the risk has been eliminated. The Sumerian texts consistently choose mitigation. This choice reflects a sober understanding of systems. Systems rarely fail for a single reason. They fail when multiple pressures align. Removing one pressure reduces risk. It does not remove it entirely. The warning remains because the system remains vulnerable. The Anunnaki, associated with judgment and fate, are part of this persistent vulnerability. Their role is not erased after one correction. They remain as long as the system they oversee continues to exist. If the warning were cancelled, the Anunnaki would need to be dismissed. Their authority would need to be revoked. Their names would need to disappear from lists of judges. Their association with fate would need to be reassigned or nullified. None of this happens. Instead, their presence continues quietly, unchanged in structure, even as narrative attention shifts elsewhere. This continuity suggests that the Sumerians did not believe the problem that required judgment had been solved permanently. They believed it had been managed. Management implies ongoing oversight. Oversight implies the possibility of reactivation. The absence of cancellation also explains why the texts resist finality so strongly. There is no ultimate resolution that closes the system. There is no final state of harmony guaranteed forever. Harmony must be maintained. Maintenance can fail. This worldview does not offer comfort in the modern sense. It offers realism. A warning that is never cancelled does not promise catastrophe. It promises accountability. Accountability does not operate continuously. It operates when thresholds are crossed. This threshold logic is embedded everywhere in the Sumerian tradition. Noise accumulates. Excess grows. Injustice spreads. Only when accumulation exceeds tolerance does correction occur. The warning exists to remind that tolerance is finite. If the warning were cancelled, tolerance would be infinite. Infinite tolerance would imply that the system can absorb unlimited strain without consequence. The Sumerians did not believe this. Their lived experience contradicted it. Floods came, cities fell, dynasties ended, the land itself shifted. No system remained stable forever. This experience shaped their cosmology. They did not imagine a world perfected beyond correction. They imagined a world that could be corrected repeatedly. Repeated correction requires persistent warning. The absence of cancellation also has implications for how the Sumerians viewed progress. Progress was not linear improvement toward a stable endpoint. It was cyclical adaptation within constraints. Advancement increased capacity. Increased capacity increased risk. This relationship is implicit in the texts. As cities grow more complex, the consequences of failure become more severe. Larger populations generate more noise. More intensive agriculture strains land. More centralized authority amplifies injustice when it fails. The warning scales with complexity. If the warning were cancelled, complexity would be safe. The texts do not support this assumption. Instead, they suggest that complexity requires greater restraint. This restraint is the responsibility of humanity during the interval. The Anunnaki do not intervene to prevent complexity. They intervene when complexity overwhelms control. The warning is not anti-progress. It is anti-excess. Excess is defined not by abundance alone, but by imbalance. A society can be wealthy and stable. It can be powerful and restrained. It becomes dangerous when growth outpaces regulation. The Sumerian texts repeatedly emphasize this distinction. Kings are praised not for conquest, but for justice. Cities are praised not for size, but for order. Prosperity is celebrated when it is balanced. This emphasis suggests that the warning targets imbalance, not success. If the warning were cancelled, success would be unconditionally safe. The texts never say this. Instead, they embed reminders that success increases responsibility. This responsibility is why the warning must remain uncancelled. To cancel it would be to declare that responsibility no longer exists. The Anunnaki, as judges, represent the enforcement of responsibility when internal mechanisms fail. Their continued presence in the texts signals that internal mechanisms are expected to fail eventually. This expectation is not pessimism. It is historical realism. No system maintains perfect balance indefinitely. The warning remains because failure remains possible. This possibility is not meant to paralyze. It is meant to motivate restraint. The Sumerians did not live in fear of divine return. They lived with awareness of limits. This awareness shaped their governance. Laws were written. Penalties were specified. Kingship was framed as conditional. Even the king could be removed by divine will if he failed to maintain order. This conditionality is a form of warning applied to leadership. Leadership without warning becomes tyranny. Warning without cancellation ensures that power remains provisional. The Anunnaki's role reinforces this. They are not allies of kings. They are not champions of humanity. They are arbiters. Arbiters do not take sides. They assess outcomes. This impartiality would be compromised if the warning were cancelled. Cancellation would imply that certain outcomes are no longer subject to assessment. The texts do not allow this implication. Instead, they preserve the warning as a constant background condition. This condition does not demand attention. It demands respect. Respect for limits. The absence of cancellation also explains why later cultures struggled with these texts. Cultures that preferred certainty and closure found the open-endedness unsettling. They introduced covenants, promises, and guarantees that the Sumerian framework lacks. These additions reflect a desire for reassurance. The Sumerian texts do not offer reassurance. They offer structure. Structure does not promise safety. It promises response. If the warning were cancelled, response would no longer be guaranteed. Guaranteeing response is essential for accountability. This accountability extends beyond human-divine relations. It applies to the natural world as well. Rivers flood when neglected. Land becomes barren when overused. Disease spreads when populations concentrate without sanitation. These are not punishments, they are responses. The Sumerians understood this intuitively. They did not separate divine warning from natural consequence. Both were expressions of imbalance corrected. The Anunnaki's association with fate places them at the intersection of these responses. Fate is not random. It is the outcome of accumulated conditions. If the warning were cancelled, fate would lose meaning. Fate requires the possibility of consequence. This possibility must remain open. The texts ensure this by never declaring an end to judgment. Even in the underworld, fate continues to be assigned. There is no final rest where evaluation ceases entirely. Existence continues under different conditions. This continuity reinforces the idea that assessment is not a one-time event. The warning persists because existence persists. This persistence does not mean constant anxiety. It means ongoing responsibility. Responsibility is easier to accept when it is diffuse. The Sumerian texts do not single out individuals as ultimate bearers of consequence. They focus on collective patterns. This collective focus reduces fear. No single action triggers catastrophe. Catastrophe emerges from accumulation. Accumulation can be slowed. It can be redirected. It can be managed. This management is the purpose of human institutions. The warning remains uncancelled because management is never complete. Even the best systems require vigilance. Vigilance without urgency. Urgency leads to panic. Panic leads to poor decisions. The Sumerians did not valorize panic. They valorized steadiness. This steadiness is reflected in their texts. The language is measured. The tone is restrained. The warnings are embedded, not shouted. If the warning were cancelled, this tone would shift. The text would declare peace, safety, or final order. They do not. Instead, they continue to copy lists of judges. They continue to preserve names associated with fate. They continue to describe correction as possible. This quiet persistence is the strongest evidence that the warning was never cancelled, not because catastrophe was expected, but because accountability was preserved. Accountability is uncomfortable, but it is stabilizing. A system that knows it will be assessed behaves differently from one that believes assessment has ended. The Sumerians wanted systems to behave responsibly even in silence. This is why divine silence is not reassuring in their worldview. It is neutral. Silence means the interval is still open. The interval is where human choice matters. If the warning were cancelled, the interval would lose meaning. Choice would lose consequence. Consequence would lose relevance. The entire structure would collapse into arbitrariness. The texts resist this collapse by preserving the warning indefinitely. This preservation does not mean the Sumerians expected perpetual crisis. They expected periodic correction. Correction is not failure. It is adjustment. Adjustment keeps systems within tolerance. Tolerance is finite. The warning exists to mark that finitude. The Anunnaki embody the point at which tolerance ends. They do not announce themselves because announcement would undermine the system. They respond when response is unavoidable. This inevitability is not destiny. It is consequence. The warning remains uncancelled because consequence remains unavoidable when limits are exceeded. This is not theology in the modern sense. It is system theory expressed through myth. The Sumerians used divine language to describe realities they observed repeatedly. Their texts are records of this observation. The absence of cancellation is deliberate. It ensures that the lesson does not expire. Lessons tied to specific events fade. Lessons tied to structure endure. The warning is structural. It applies whenever similar conditions arise. This makes it timeless without making it urgent. Timeless warnings are often misunderstood as predictions. They are not. They are conditions. If the warning were cancelled, the condition would no longer apply. The texts never say this. Instead, they continue quietly to preserve the possibility of correction. This possibility is not meant to frighten. It is meant to guide behaviour toward balance. Balance is not static. It must be maintained. Maintenance is work. The Sumerians valued work. They did not imagine a world where effort ceased. The gods withdrew precisely so that work would matter. The warning remains because work can fail. Failure is not shameful. It is instructive. Correction follows failure not to punish, but to reset. Reset is not erasure. It is adjustment. This cycle repeats as long as systems exist. The warning persists as long as cycles persist. There is no final cycle. There is no ultimate cancellation. There is only continued operation within limits. The Anunnaki, preserved without narrative excess, without cancellation, without finality, stand as a reminder of this ongoing condition. They are not waiting to return in triumph or wrath. They are present as a possibility that never disappears, not because the world is doomed, but because the world is never finished. And in a world that is never finished, warnings do not end. They remain, quietly, uncancelled, not demanding belief, not demanding fear, only demanding that balance be taken seriously, long after the memory of the last correction has faded, and long before the need for the next one becomes impossible to ignore. As the texts draw toward their quiet edge, there is no declaration, no final warning spoken aloud, no closing vision of gods descending or judgment unfolding. Instead, there is a lingering implication that never resolves itself into certainty. The possibility of return is not framed as a dramatic future event. It is treated as something already accounted for, something that never needed to be announced because it was never removed from consideration. If return was always expected, then expectation did not take the form modern minds assume. It was not anticipation. It was not anxiety. It was not vigilance directed toward the sky or the heavens. It was built into behaviour, into structure, into restraint practiced without spectacle. Expectation, in the Sumerian sense, was quiet. It lived in how cities were planned with limits rather than infinite expansion. It lived in how kings were reminded that their authority could be withdrawn. It lived in how laws emphasized balance over domination. It lived in how myths refused to end cleanly, how gods withdrew without leaving, how judgment was preserved without being activated. Expectation did not require waiting. Waiting implies passivity. Expectation, as encoded in these texts, implied readiness without fixation. The system didn't pause, and neither did humanity. Life continued, work continued, growth continued. But growth was never framed as unlimited, and silence was never mistaken for immunity. If return was always expected, then the purpose of the texts was never to predict it. The purpose was to make prediction unnecessary. A system that knows how correction works does not need to be warned loudly. It only needs to remember that correction exists. The Sumerian texts do this without emphasis, without repetition that demands attention, without fear as motivation. They trust the reader to live within limits. This trust is perhaps the most unsettling aspect of the entire tradition. There is no guarantee offered, no promise that humanity will succeed, no assurance that preparation will always be sufficient. There is only the assumption that effort matters, that balance delays consequence, and that consequence arrives when balance fails. Return in this framework is not a goal or an ending, it is a function. Functions do not need ceremony, they operate when triggered. The Anunnaki do not need to be imagined watching, waiting, or preparing. Their role is already complete in the sense that it is already defined. They are not gathering strength. They are not planning intervention. They are simply associated with the moment when accumulation ends and assessment begins. If return was always expected, then it was expected in the same way winter is expected after summer, not on a date, not with dread, but as a condition that emerges when cycles turn. Winter does not arrive because it is summoned. It arrives because conditions change. The Sumerians understood this intuitively. Their world was shaped by seasonal rivers, shifting soils, and long-term patterns that could not be controlled by desire or belief. Their cosmology reflects this reality. Divine return is not negotiated. It is not appealed against. It is not celebrated. It is endured. And endurance, not escape, is the quiet virtue running beneath the entire body of text. The absence of a final scene is not an oversight. It is intentional. A final scene would suggest closure. Closure would imply that the system no longer needs to operate. The Sumerians did not believe in closure of that kind. There is no final age where judgment is no longer possible. There is no perfected state where limits dissolve. There is only continued operation within constraints. This makes the end of the texts feel unfinished to modern readers. It can feel unsettling, as if something is missing. But what is missing is reassurance, not meaning. Meaning is present everywhere. Meaning is present in the refusal to cancel the warning. Meaning is present in the silence that follows certain names. Meaning is present in the emphasis on timing rather than presence. Meaning is present in the long intervals where nothing happens, because nothing needs to happen yet. If return was always expected, then fear was never the point. Responsibility was. Responsibility does not need constant reminders. It needs structure. It needs continuity. It needs a framework that remains intact even when memory fades and stories change. The Sumerian texts provide that framework. They do not tell humanity how to avoid return forever. They tell humanity how to live in a way that makes return unnecessary for as long as possible. This is not optimism. It is realism practiced patiently. Return is not framed as punishment. It is framed as correction. Correction is not evil. It is simply what happens when imbalance becomes unsustainable. This understanding removes drama from the idea of return and replaces it with seriousness. Seriousness does not shout. It does not rush. It does not insist on belief. It waits. Waiting, in this final sense, is not something the gods do while humanity watches. It is something humanity does while the system runs. The Anunnaki are not the focus of this waiting. Humanity is. Humanity waits not by standing still, but by continuing to act within limits, knowing that limits exist. If return was always expected, then the real question was never when it would happen. The real question was whether it would need to. The texts do not answer that question. They do not try to. They leave it open because it depends on behaviour, not destiny. As the noise of interpretation fades and the surface drama recedes, what remains is a quiet understanding. The Sumerian worldview was not built to frighten people into obedience. It was built to sustain systems over long periods of silence. Silence is not emptiness. Silence is the interval where everything that matters accumulates. In that silence, humanity acts, builds, governs, overreaches, corrects, learns. And the possibility of return remains, not as a threat hovering above, but as a boundary that gives shape to action. If return was always expected, it was expected in the same way gravity is expected. Not as an event, but as a condition that does not need announcement to remain real. The Sumerians did not need to imagine the gods coming back to know that consequences follow imbalance. They encoded that knowledge into clay, repetition, omission, and restraint. Those tablets did not survive to warn of a date. They survive to remind that no system escapes evaluation forever. This reminder does not belong to the past. It does not belong to prophecy. It belongs to structure, and structure does not age. It waits, quietly, just as these texts do, resting in their long silence, not asking to be believed, not demanding to be feared, only offering the same calm implication they always have. that return was never cancelled, that balance was never guaranteed, and that the long interval in between was never meant to be wasted.